Hey, Bitcoin Wealth Builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to episode 106 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. Today, we're going to be discussing, and it's a bit of a stretch, but I think if you watch right till the end, you're actually going to see the connections. But what is the link between the announcement of 50-year mortgages, the correction in the market, the quote-unquote AI bubble, and Al-Qaeda boss visiting the White House next to Donald Trump? We're going to be discussing it, as always, in three different sections. This week in Bitcoin, this week in macro, and this week in geopolitics. If you are new to the show, welcome. My name is Simon Dixon. I spent the last 25 years of my life connecting the dots between money, investing, and then later Bitcoin as well. And we're going to be going through the different three parts of the show today. The main theme of this week in Bitcoin is we're going to be having a little bit of a look at the controversy and the war between China and US over who owns the 127,000 Bitcoin that the US decided to confiscate. Then in part two, we're going to be doing this week in macro. In this week in macro, we're going to be going through, are the 50-year mortgages a bank bailout? How to utilize them so that you can reverse the effect of the bank bailout, and also answering the question once and for all, are we in an AI bubble, and what is driving the markets right now, particularly during this crash, and what we expect to come next. In part three, we're going to be doing this week in geopolitics. And in this week in geopolitics, we're going to be making sense over everything we've been covering over the months, years at Bitcoin Hard Talk in the geopolitical section. And we're going to be tying it all together. It was a very symbolic meeting. And we're going to be going through a blog that I also posted, as well as what happened this week in geopolitics, from 9/11 to the White House. So let's jump right in. We got a great show today, and we're going to be covering everything around that. So this week in Bitcoin, China versus the US, and who owns the 127,000 Bitcoin. We're going to take a real look around the world today. We're going to go from China to Europe to the Middle East to America and look at everything that happened this week in Bitcoin, because it was a pretty packed week as well. So look, firstly, I just want to say to you, congratulations on the opportunity to buy Bitcoin at below $100,000 again. For those that watch my show and the long-term listeners, you know we completely ignore price. So while everybody is trying to clickbait you into saying things that wind you up and fear you into selling your Bitcoin, and then later you ending up in some Wall Street financial product, we tell you, we relax. We don't care about the price. The same thing I've been telling everybody for 14 years on this channel, ever since Bitcoin was $3. Own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. Ignore the price and value your wealth in Bitcoin. When you value your wealth in Bitcoin, you love it when the price goes down, as most people that understand this in my community, the further the price goes down, the more you get to work your fiat currency and buy some cheaper Bitcoin when you own some more Bitcoin this month. And you want this to go on for as long as possible, because we are transitioning to this world of Bitcoin AI, central bank digital currencies, and stable coins. And we're obviously protecting ourselves. You have a 4-year challenge. Do it for 4 years and come back to me and tweet me on X in 4 years and let me know how you got on. I have never met anybody that didn't outperform, and I can't promise this will happen again, but I can tell you what I'm doing. I have not met anybody that did not thank me. And I'm talking from people that went from nothing to billionaires and millionaires and everything in between. So let's make sure that you congratulate yourself on being able to get some Bitcoin below $100,000, and you're chillax while everybody else is freaking out. It's just a correction in line with the market. I've watched my $30 Bitcoin crash to $3. I've watched my $20,000 Bitcoin crash to $3,000. I've watched my $70,000 Bitcoin crash to $17,000. And now I've seen my $125,000 Bitcoin correct to $96,000. Don't worry about it. The further it goes down, the more you get to buy with your fiat currency. Now, let's contrast that with what's happening with fiat currency. Bitcoin is the boycott and the offboard. So let's take a look at Europe before we go into China, Dubai, and various other Czech Republic and America as well. Europe's biggest monetary kind of overhaul since 1999, right before the 2000 dot-com boom and bust, when my father lost all of his savings. And then I answered the question for him when he asked me, son, what happened to my money in year 2000? Well, a year before that, we had an overhaul around fiat currency. We entered into this dot-com boom and bust era. My father lost all of his money, everything he'd ever worked for, from rags to getting his first £1 million and then losing absolutely everything. And that answering that question took me to Bitcoin and speaking at the first Bitcoin conference in 2011 and writing the very first published book in the world to include Bitcoin, and then investing in over 100 companies that made the industry. So anyway, what's happening in Europe with the euro? Well, if you hadn't noticed, Europe is a train wreck. And we'll go through more in the geopolitical section, but there was escalations in the Ukraine-Russia war. Remember, any long-term listeners, you'll know that the Russia-Ukraine war is in fact a war between the financial industrial complex and Europe in order to strategically weaken Europe so that BlackRock and Blackstone can acquire all those resources and Russia ends up with more territory. And sadly, the evil proof of weapons network that cares nothing about humans' life is going to make a lot of money at the expense of Ukrainian lives and Russian lives. That's what the proof of weapon works. And that's why we boycott into peaceful proof of work. But anyway, what's happening in Europe? So by 2027, and that will come by very fast, it'll be 2026 before you know it, the European Union is restructuring money again, is reinventing money. Its official goal is to stop the $700 billion in annual money laundering. Now, anybody that's watched my show knows that the money laundering is in fact done by the banksters, in the banksters, protected by the intelligence agencies, for the system, by the system, and they pay the government, and they have black op operations outside the system. And so they're not coming after money laundering. They're coming after your money, and they want to make sure that they have some more controls around that, because they want them to do, those that control the governments is the large banksters, and they do the money laundering, but then they have to put all these pretense and regulations because the chosen banks still get to be Jeffrey Epstein's banksters, and they get to pay the $285 million fine that JP Morgan paid when it was connected to all the Epstein controversies that are currently still being weaponized in order to give more control to banks. But anyway, the unofficial consequences is obviously more control, more surveillance. We are ushering it in the West, a surveillance state, now that the proof of weapons network controls the US, the European Union, the UK, Israel, Australia, Canada, and it's deciding whether China or US is going to be in charge of parts of the global South that are near America. Sadly, Venezuela and various other regions and Europe are going to be sacrificed to the proof of weapons network unless they move east. If they carry on west, they will be the victim of the military industrial complex and the forever war model now that they are retreating from further afield because of rising powers. So there are three pillars of the new system that the euro is going to be. And remember, we've always talked about it on Bitcoin Hard Talk. Because the Bank for International Settlements created the European Union in order to create the European Central Bank to print money via unelected officials in order to redistribute money via NATO and the euro dollar into the US stock market to pump up the price of the banks and financial institutions that are controlled by the asset managers like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Europe is just a vassal state for printing money, pumping money into the stocks. And so what do they want? They know that when you create the environment of a K-shaped economy, it gets to civil unrest. When you have civil unrest, you take the proof of weapons network, financial weapons of mass destruction that they beta tested in the war zones like Gaza, occupation as a service, in West Bank, and integration with drones in Ukraine. and they put it into a central bank digital currency so that the European Central Bank can control all the European countries and make them beg for forgiveness. Right now, the UK is flying in terms of its interest rate on its long-term bonds as it gets completely wrecked by these covert operations to acquire the whole country on the cheap. So what is the first thing they're going to be doing? Well, the first thing is a cash ban. And so cash payments over $10,000 euros are going to be completely illegal once this is implemented. The second thing that they're going to be doing is they're going to require crypto identity mandate. So this is where MiCA, the markets in crypto assets, is going to basically wipe out any type of anonymous wallets, make you put it through the exchanges, put it through the custodians, and drive you into BlackRock's euro-denominated Bitcoin ETF rather than you owning Bitcoin in self-custody. And so you got to get your self-custody. Obviously, they're going to be doing Know Your Customer, which is how they get the data that they want in order to implement their control mechanism. The third is the digital euro. So they're taking a euro that is currently created by the private banks, and the European Central Bank is waging war on the European banks by actually having their own creation, the European Central Bank digital dollar. And so the central bank gets to create the digital euro into its network of European banks, and they have programmable money, which is a central bank digital currency, in order to have a state-backed digital currency where they say that they're going to have privacy features. We will watch what those privacy features are, but I'm expecting fully programmable and traceable money in a central bank digital currency. Now, what we've always said is that the BlackRock and the financial institutions and the banksters, the financial industrial complex, is going to turn Europe, UK into a surveillance state with a central bank digital currency. And in America is going to be privatized into programmable stable coins integrated with covert social credit scores through the vast technical industrial complex, so that all the profits from government-controlled Europe, UK, funnel up to privatized controlled America, and they are owned by the banks. And the banks are pushing the K-shaped economy, manufacturing civil unrest so that they can acquire the assets on the cheap. So they obviously, because in America, the banks are the shareholders of the Federal Reserve, they want to usher it all up, privatize it, and then manufacture the type of environment in the economy that just benefits rules by banks while they reset the world order, as we're witnessing right now, by controlling those capital flows. And the digital euro in the European Central Bank and is the next phase in the plan. Now, anybody that has been watching this for the long term, you'll know that even in my book in 2011, I discussed digital currencies and central bank digital currencies and how they're created by banks, and they would have been preparing for this. We're getting closer and closer and closer. So the European Union is essentially balancing between the China surveillance model, but the difference is in China, at least people know what they're signing up for. It's not a civil unrest country. It's not a left versus right divide. It's got the money that is created. It goes into a state banking system and then is reinvested in building China via a China first policy. In Europe, it just goes into the private sector, and then it goes up to America, where the banks essentially work against the American people, against the European people, against the British people, even against the other members and nodes on the proof of weapons network. And so they know that they need surveillance money, and they beta tested, lockdowns and all sorts of stuff, got us all on the tech. But the European version is where you have the China model, but for private profits by banksters that get to create the digital euro, the digital dollar, and the digital pound, and the Canadian pound, and the Mexican dollar as well. But at the same time, they can then use the equivalent of Russian sanctions, but on the people, integrated with carbon credits, with various other mandates, and they can implement through financial punishment or reward how you spend your money. And then doing things like weaponizing the US dollar, which is what they do through the payment rails like Visa, MasterCard. And essentially, they're painting it that they're giving Europeans some freedom from America. That's the narrative that they need. But we know that it all goes up to the same network, which is currently hosting itself in the American capital markets and Wall Street, but is hedging now and starting to set up more and more of its offices in the Middle East at the moment as well. So the digital euro essentially aims to reduce dependency upon the US is the narrative and the US payment rails. But we know that this is just creating a covert network for financial weapons of mass destruction. Surveillance is the infrastructure that will be built. And we know that once surveillance is built, it lasts forever. It doesn't go back. Think Patriot attack. You needed 9/11. We're going to be covering more of that in the geopolitics political section. Then you have fear manufactured, drive the change. And then when you drive the change, in order, you end up with something that lasts forever. So today they'll be telling you that we're doing this in order to stop criminals. So why do you think those borders are opened? Why do you think they're creating religious and racial tensions? Why do you think they're creating all of these different operations? Because they need violence so that then they can say, right, we're going to come in and stop the crime with digital ID. They've already tested that by saying we're going to use it on immigrants. And so you think that, that will be the narrative. And then tomorrow it would just be used for basically tax control, so that you will pay tax upon payment on a guilty until proven innocent system where you'll have to collect it afterwards. And then you'll have negative interest rates or positive interest rates integrated into artificial intelligence and social credit scores in order to drive the different types of behavior, so they can drive your spending not only through debt slavery, but also through central bank digital currencies and stable coins into the companies that they want to pump up or take off the proof of weapons network, as they control the wealth of this quote unquote capitalist system, which is 100% dependent upon money printing and a debt-based Ponzi scheme. But of course you say, yes, we want, this is capitalism. That's the way to do it. But they can use it for political suppression. They can use it for capital controls, but of course, private capital controls. In China, the capital controls are to make sure that the money is reinvested in China. Here, it's about capital controls to make sure that the money flows up to the banks and financial institution and the proof of weapons network, so they can asset strip you of everything, so that you end up with a 50-year mortgage, a 100-year mortgage, an infinite mortgage, and you will own nothing and be happy. And so the US is essentially trying to centralize Bitcoin as a counter as well. They're doing that by saying, we're going to be the crypto capital of the world. We're going to build our stable coins. We're going to tokenize everything. And then we're going to launch Bitcoin ETFs, and we're going to get millions and millions of Bitcoin. And we're going to get you to put it in your 401k. And then we're going to ask you to borrow against it, so that we can centralize as much Bitcoin in the American side, so that eventually, if they ever want to seize, use it as collateral, then they can do that through the ETFs. Now, those with Bitcoin in self-custody, is your mission is to get as much into self-custody so that you can decide where you want to go. Your wealth comes with you. You can own your own money. You can spend your own money, and you can benefit from the fact that there is a fixed supply that will never change. Now, they will create paper Bitcoin, but the real Bitcoin will be the premium Bitcoin, which is why you got to get as much into self-custody by owning more Bitcoin every month. And also, of course, you can do it with gold. But when you're trying to escape countries with gold, it's a lot harder to come with you. And people find it hard to custody it at scale. And so they end up in ETFs. That's the challenge. But it will still protect you. Gold is useful for that. And Bitcoin is in self-custody is how you protect yourself. Now, obviously, the US is really pushing stable coins. So JP Morgan is essentially testing, as we speak, private blockchain stablecoins. Now, remember, JP Morgan, the bank lobby, was the one that got Ingenious Act that you have to have a banking license in order to use the Federal Reserve accounts as collateral to issue trillions of dollars of stable coins. And then you can have a covert central bank digital currency for the benefit of JP Morgan. And then they can incentivize you to use it because those that have a banking license get to pay yield. And so they can utilize the debt capital markets, pay you some of the yield, and incentivize you into this private blockchain that they're looking to do. Now, they're hedging just in case that doesn't work, because they tried to do that in Nigeria and it didn't get the adoption. Obviously, they need to create fear. That's why you're getting access. That's why you're getting more violence, a multi-decade operation to manufacture violence, as we covered a couple of weeks ago, last week, in Nigeria. I won't go into that now, but I covered that last week in the geopolitical section. But to hedge that, they also have BlackRock, who's now going all in on public chains and acquiring more companies. One of the companies that I invested in many years ago was a company called Securitize, a Bank to the Future, the company I founded. We funded over 100 of the largest companies. One of them was Securitize, and they started going into security tokens. And BlackRock wants to tokenize everything. So they're investing in companies like Securitize. They've now made them go public at a $1.5 billion valuation. And they're getting those BlackRock investments, and they want to do it on public chains. And so while companies will benefit from these public chains, what else is BlackRock doing? Well, BlackRock is obviously also launching the ETH ETF, because Bitcoin is proof of work, so it protects you from those that own the Bitcoin controlling the network. Proof of stake doesn't. Proof of stake means if you stake your ETH, you get a vote in the governance of the network. So they're going all in on the public chains while they build the Bitcoin ETF so they can have the largest vote. And they're using other nodes in their network, like Cantor Fitzgerald, to launch stable coins and custody those treasuries so they can dump more and more of the US debt at subsidized interest rates. Covered that last week. And then at the same time, have those stable coins where they can control the stake behind the network through the ETFs. This is why Bitcoin's proof of work and the vast hash power and its distributed supercomputer, which is hosted outside of America, while 40% are mining in America, BlackRock's trying to centralize the entire American infrastructure. But fortunately, America doesn't control all the infrastructure. You've got competing countries. And that's very, very important that we remain that. You know, remember Trump? He said, we want Bitcoin to be made in America. That's basically for BlackRock. He works for BlackRock and the financial industrial complex who want to centralize Bitcoin. You can read the clues because it's BlackRock's policy, who was also, in my opinion, the creator of the tariff policy to reset the world order. We're covering more about that in the macro section as well. So one of the companies we invested in, and I invested in early, ended up going public, which is Coinbase. And now Coinbase, what are they doing? They're launching their pre-launch token securities platform. The company I co-founded, Bank to the Future, we sold our US brokerage when all of this surveillance was happening. And we saw this. We ended up selling our brokerage to Coinbase. We exited our operational business, and now it looks like they're using that to do pre-launch security tokens. And so, you know, we're starting to see why they bought that, and we were exiting because we want everyone to go to Bitcoin in self-custody and not drive people around these merry-go-round of distractions of security tokens and all the other stuff. At the same time, staking ETFs can now pay out yield. So BlackRock can now try and incentivize you not to stake your own ETH, but to stake your ETH with them so that they can then pay out the yield. The regulators gave that permission in this deregulation environment. And so now you can get yield on your ETH ETF. They are doing everything they can to control the network and incentivize people. Now, at the same time, what did I tell you? I was warning everyone about the Bitcoin treasury companies. If you're a long-term listener, you wouldn't have touched any of them. But the Bitcoin treasury, the most successful one that has centralized 650,000 Bitcoin, that is a Wall Street puppet called Strategy, which has got massive debt products that, within that structure, as well as the equity products. Their net asset value, i.e. the value of the Bitcoin that they hold relative to their share price, has been sending people a little bit loopy because they go below 1. Now, for many of the other Bitcoin treasury companies, it has gone below 1. At the same time, within the proof of weapons network is a bunch of plausible deniability hedge funds. When they had regulations that said you can't take proprietary trading at the same time as creating dollars and making books, they just have a network of investing in hedge funds, and you send these hedge funds out there as dollar vigilantes and bond vigilantes, and they can short stocks and make public announcements. They can, implement and basically manipulate the price of shares by through these strategies. You give them vast access. They started shorting many of Strategy, and there's been a bit of a fight between Michael Saylor and some of those that are shorting the stock, buying Bitcoin and shorting the stock. And so you see this often on X, which is just a financial weapon of mass destruction that says, as I've always said, if Saylor has a public company and he utilizes debt capital markets, he's owned by Wall Street. And so they send out their hedge funds and they basically say, be a good boy or we'll kill your price. We'll give you a B- rating on S&P. We ain't going to let you get into the S&P index fund until you comply more. And we'll knock you off your boots. And if we want to send you into Chapter 11, we'll manufacture a pump and dump cycle, a liquidation cycle, and we'll just own you and we'll buy it at below discount net asset value. Wall Street is not a free market. It is a captured market for the benefit of the proof of weapons network to extract value from you over to them. And that's why the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and more assets are consolidating into fewer and fewer hands and more value as well. So what do they need next? They need Clarity Act. They got the Genius Act. Now they need Clarity Act. And we had the Clarity Act draft that came out, essentially giving the CFTC, the CFT is the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission. That is the regulatory oversight body of commodities. Now, historically, when they were doing the engineered pump and dump and they tried to wipe out the crypto market, they used the SEC and Gary Gensler as their weapon through Operation Choke Point 2.0. Then they engineered the Biden administration bear market attack on crypto, and then got the Bitcoin ETF, and then got all the banks in, started taking out the crypto-friendly banks, started getting their own, installed Trump. Trump does the crypto-friendly environment, tells everybody we're going to have a Bitcoin strategic reserve. There's no Bitcoin strategic reserve other than confiscating Bitcoin so far. Now, the SEC is the one that was saying these are securities. The crypto scams, which are securities, the crypto scams, which is a Silicon Valley industry in order to extract Bitcoin from you, and the meme coins and all the other things to turn you into degenerate gamblers rather than long-term buying Bitcoin each month. So the SEC basically has always had, when we had a brokerage, we wanted to democratize investing, but eventually, we worked with US, we could only do accredited investors. You end up making the rich richer. Fortunately, we got so many people rich with Bitcoin that they ended up becoming accredited investors so they could invest in many of the companies. But as the surveillance started getting higher and higher and higher, we sold the brokerage to Coinbase, and now they're doing it there. But anyway, the difference between the CFTC and the SEC is a couple of things. It's the accredited investor rule. Now, with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, they don't have any accredited investor rules. So you can buy gold as anybody, average Joe Schmo. And I don't mind that. I think that's a good thing. However, the Securities and Exchange Commission, they say you have to be high net worth and then they have different types of rules around that, and those compliance. It helps the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, by just saying you're too poor to invest type thing. And so with the CFTC, they don't have that. Now, that's good, deregulation, but at the same time, what goal does it achieve? It gets more and more people into crypto scams, so that they can centralize even retail money on top of, which will always be the wealth extraction. They also have another rule, which is seasoning rules. What this essentially does is it prevents crypto tokens, going live from day one. All the big scams that they happen in the SEC, you can't do that because you have like a 1 year lock-in. There's different rules. It can't trade after 1 year, and there's all these different rules you have to comply with. With the CFTC, you can trade from day one. So now they can get retail investors, pump and dump schemes via Silicon Valley VCs to dump crypto tokens, get as much Bitcoin, and then centralize that Bitcoin with the ETF infrastructure and use the hedge funds to come after it as well. And so that is basically why they're going for the CFTC. Now they want to set all these rules during the Trump administration. And obviously they're going to be engineering regime change in 2028, and that's baked into it anyway. So the CFTC, it basically doesn't have those seasoning requirements. And so, I believe in more free markets, but I just want people that what comes with free markets is education. So you got to understand these different moves, and you got to play the opposite of the game. And the simple game is own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. So anyway, Clarity Act is likely to move into Senate next week. And this is the plan to centralize as much Bitcoin in America for the proof of weapons network and make sure that you don't own it in self-custody. They've also started looking at things like making sure you can't use coin joins. We covered more of this last week. And also unique wallet addresses for every transaction. And again, this is why jurisdiction matters, self-custody matters, and understand that, just getting through via the simple Bitcoin in self-custody. So the US is now testing more and more seizures. So if you look at the entire Bitcoin strategic reserve, none of it was acquired. And they said the promise to the Bitcoin community when Trump came in was that they're going to build Bitcoin strategic reserve, and there was a Bitcoin Act, and they were going to buy 1 million Bitcoin. What they forgot to say is that actually we're going to steal 1 million Bitcoin. And so this is why you got to be aware. The government's not your friend. Many people fell for the PSYOP. Wall Street's not your friend. Many people are falling for the PSYOP. Fortunately, we got Bitcoin Hard Talk, so you don't need to fall for these things. So we're seeing that right now. What happened this week? So China came out and accused the US of seizing 127,000 stolen Bitcoin that are valued at today's price. There's been a correction, or last week's price anyway, $13 billion, and calls to basic, and they called it a state level hack. Now, I've always been suspicious that whenever they say China's hacking or Russia's hacking or North Korea's hacking, knowing what I know, it's probably via one of their nodes like Israel that has all the cybersecurity and illegal activities for the proof of weapons network, and many of those hacking operations. I personally believe that's how it's done. I don't have any evidence. That's just speculation. But obviously, China now was accusing the US of hacking those Bitcoins in order to seize them. And so immediately, the US came out and said, hey, we've got now 300,000 Bitcoins in our Bitcoin strategic reserve. So Bitcoin basically came from what this was. It was a scam, and there was global victims. There were many in China. There were some in America. There were victims all around the world, but it was a scam that happened in, I think it was Cambodia was where they were located, but it was a global scam. And basically it was coming from like forced labor, scam. And basically it was networks that were run all across Southeast Asia. And it was these rings that had like all these different types of groups. I didn't read through all the different things. You get the point. But anyway, it was basically something called Cambodia's Prince Group, and basically they defrauded victims worldwide. And that was Chinese citizens. So China was coming after it. The Department of Justice was also coming after it. And basically, China wants the US to return all of those Bitcoins to the victims. And so they were saying, this isn't our Bitcoin. This isn't your Bitcoin. This is victims' Bitcoin. And that's how it's meant to work. Now, the US Department of Justice has now seized the 127,000 Bitcoin. It was done via a partnership between the US and the UK doing an investigation. And basically, from what we can tell right now, the US is just saying, we're going to keep them. And we're just going to forfeit the Bitcoin under something called the criminal proceeds laws. Now, this is the type of thing I'm talking about. Be very careful what you ask for. The criminal proceeds laws come into force. Why? Because you scare people through engineered civil unrest. And in order to protect you and save you and to protect from the money laundering, they give you more and more control structures. Now, what do? They control it. And rather than giving it back to the victims, they keep it for themselves. Now, obviously, the government is captured by the proof of weapons network and the private banks. So they'll use it as collateral, just like they do America's gold. It ends up on the Federal Reserve balance sheet as Bitcoin becomes more and more of a strategic asset. It won't be used to save the country. It will be used to bail out, socialize the losses and privatize the gains to the banks. That much is a guaranteed. Of course, Trump's putting on the whole narrative that we're going to build Bitcoin strategic reserves to save the dollar and make America great again. What is America? The same as UK, same as Europe. It is owned by the banks and financial institutions through ultra financialization, securitization, and now tokenization, as well as stable coins and central bank digital currencies. So China came out and basically called this a confiscation and theft by the US. And so you get these different types of narratives. And everyone says, we're the Americans, we're taking on China, we'll just keep the Bitcoin. So the Americans are cheering it on, saying we'll steal victims' Bitcoin. All is fair in love and war were the types of comments I got on my X. And I know what it's like. I've been involved in these, I helped a bunch of victims that had 120,000 Bitcoin that was stolen through the Bitfinex exchange, do a recovery plan so they can get their Bitcoin back. Who's got those Bitcoin? They belong to the shareholders. The US has got them. So the Department of Justice has over 100,000 Bitcoin that was stolen from the victims that then became shareholders, and they haven't given those Bitcoin back. They just keep them in this particular case. And this is what happened, for example, during Celsius. They put it in a bankruptcy process, just like they will with the treasury companies. And in Chapter 11, you become a bitch for the lawyers. The system was built for lawyers, by lawyers. They spend client money. They sell all the assets off to their buddies in Silicon Valley and venture capital. And they construct companies that have their buddies in. And then they give themselves 5-year jobs in order to manage these assets. I've been through all of this before. I speak from experience. You don't have to make these mistakes. And I know you believe in the system, but I worked in the system. I know what Wall Street's like because I was one of those people. Like, I left the system in 2006 to help people understand how their system works. Well, anyway, the Bitcoin strategic reserve so far is being done purely by seizure rather than purchase. And they will tell you whatever you need to hear in order to believe. And they lie to you. Everything is a lie. Every accusation is a confession. When they say China's building a social credit score, they mean we're building a social credit score. When they say China's doing a genocide, they mean we're doing a genocide. When they're saying China is a surveillance state, they mean we're building a covert surveillance state. It's all happening in China, but China doesn't hide it. America does hide it. And they have covert operations. And it's all done for privatization rather than reinvesting it back into the people. So we are now told that the US Bitcoin strategic reserve is 325,000 Bitcoin worth $36 billion. And if they returned the Bitfinex coins, and if they returned the coins to victims, the people that actually own that Bitcoin, then they would have less Bitcoin than China. So they want to keep the Bitcoin. But as I said, it would just be collateralized into the financial industrial complex that controls the system anyway. So all of it was from seizures. Where were those seizures? They're not buying Bitcoin. Basically, it was from criminal forfeitures. So as I said, we had Bitfinex, which was about 100,000 of the Bitcoin, which should belong to shareholders. I'm one of those shareholders. Silk Road, which was obviously the illegal drug market. The Trump administration, in order to scam Bitcoiners into thinking that he's helping us, he pardoned Ross Ulbright as well. Maybe that came with keeping some of the seizures, whatever it was. Now, obviously, that was criminal activity, and it wasn't victims because people were engaging in illegal activities. But the Southeast Asia scam was just 100% victims. And so the US says that forfeiture is standard law enforcement practice. They're setting the rules so that you cheer them on, saying we're going to make America great again and have a bunch of Bitcoin for our national security, so that they can set the rules that they will then use against you. You've got to be smarter. We've seen this time and time again. So basically, China says that the victims are being deprived of stolen property. They called it state-sponsored Bitcoin theft. Everyone says, but we only care, China's the one that we need to concern ourselves with. Right. What about in the Middle East? What's happening in the Middle East? So let's go around the world. So we've done Europe. We've done a bit of UK. We've done a little bit of China. We've done a little bit of America. What about the Middle East? The one that's going to be sat in the middle between the rising power China and the falling empire in the West. Well, that is part of the Gulf countries. We cover them a lot more in the geopolitical section. But Dubai did a seizure of stable coins. Now, this was theft. This is why stable coins exist. It's an innocent until proven guilty system. And if crime is committed, they can be seized because they are a digital currency that exists on a blockchain that you can spend on an innocent until proven guilty system, but then they can seize them when there is activities. That's why they're good for spending, but they're not good for saving. That's why Bitcoin in self-custody sits in the saving bucket. Basically, there's a new Dubai court, especially for digital assets. Now, remember, the stable coins with the Trump administration are being built to facilitate capital outflows from America over to the Middle East in tax-neutral jurisdiction. And then they're doing things like investing in Binance and the exchanges so that they can have tax neutrality and be at the center of the world as the geopolitics comes out. We'll cover more about that in the geopolitical section. But they basically froze $456 million of stable coins, and they were linked to Justin Sun's bailout of True USD. The issuer of the company that was issuing them was Teach3 X, and they were custodied via a company in Hong Kong, which is First Digital Trust. That I was a shareholder in that company in order to support custody in Hong Kong as well. But they have been seized, so limit your stablecoin exposure. Just think about whatever they beta test is what they bring back to America as we enter into this privatized surveillance state, 1984 Orwellian nightmare with full government control in Europe and UK, with the profits coming up to the stable coins and the tokenize everything to get it right into the hands of the corporations in America that are then deploying that capital over to the Middle East and recognizing that there is global shifts as manufactured civil unrest happens across the West, so they can acquire the assets on the Jeep. So what about Czech Republic? So what about these European countries? Well, one of the countries, Czech, the central bank, which is a member of the Bank for International Settlements, tested buying Bitcoin and stables and digital assets. The Czech National Bank, they did a beta test where they bought $1 million for testing. Now, I'm not sure whether Europe is going to allow this to happen or whether they want to put one of their nodes in the proof of weapons network to try and get as much Bitcoin so they can put it back to the network through the Bank for International Settlements up to the Fed and the privatized seizure by the banks. But maybe this is something that we need to keep watching. Basically, if a government wants to free itself from the central bank, but when the central bank buys it, that goes up to the privatized interest as well. But basically, they're exploring whether they could do up to 5% of their reserves. I looked at the Czech National Bank, CNB. I think this would be worth approximately $7 billion, 5% of their reserves. Basically, they're looking at whether they can plan to experiment with having Bitcoin as a reserve asset for the central bank. So meanwhile, on the adoption side, so that's what the governments and the Wall Streets and the proof of weapons network are doing. Meanwhile, there are a bunch of companies that are pushing some type of adoption. In America, you had Cash App. They announced that they're going to be allowing their customers to pay over Bitcoin. And they're going to be using Rails that is using USD balance, convert it into USD on top of Bitcoin, and letting them pay anyone in Bitcoin and using Lightning Network. This is brilliant. This is the type of thing we like to see. This is using the right network, proof of work, rather than proof of stake that can be controlled and centralized. And so the company Block Square, which is Jack Dorsey, who used to own Twitter, he's allowing merchants to pay with Lightning Network as well. He's always been pushing, he's got an interesting story. He was obviously part of the early circles of PayPal mafia, ended up creating Twitter. Then Twitter, once it goes public, it becomes on the net, part of the proof of weapons network. He then escaped the network. X ended up buying. Who did X do? X would borrow against his Tesla stock, privatize it, and then co-opt it with the Gulf countries. And then the banks would lend money against the X stock so that if they want to control Elon Musk, like maybe he starts talking about Epstein and Trump and various other things, you can knock his share price down by using financial weapons of mass destruction and then signal capital flows over to Oracle. And now suddenly Elon Musk isn't the richest man in America. Larry Ellison is the richest man in America. But then you knock it back down and you take their net worth down as a signal, don't mess with us. And obviously they gave him the American arm of TikTok so that they could control the algorithm as a technical weapon of mass destruction for the technical industrial complex. But they construct the financial products so that you can control all of these private companies and make sure they stand in line to the agenda. Now, one of the banks, SoFi, which I believe was part of Mike Cagney. Maybe I got this one wrong, but I think Mike Cagney was part of that, who just launched Figure. Figure is a tokenized security token exchange that just went public on NASDAQ. Let me know in the comments if I got that one wrong. But anyway, they are a fully chartered bank, and they're going to be offering crypto trading, whatever that means, whether it's Bitcoin and the crypto market. But now within your bank, you can offboard from your bank, convert it into crypto, and then get it in self-custody, hopefully. So we'll keep watching what those integrations happen. Obviously, more and more banks are going to be doing that. They'll be adding it to their balance sheet, and then they can create paper version of it. And the one in self-custody will become unique in this two-tiered Bitcoin system now that Wall Street's in the game. A couple of the companies I invested in early, Coinbase and Robinhood, that are now part of the proof of weapons network because they went public. Coinbase and Robinhood, I invested in when they were private. They're fighting to basically get their bank charters. So you got the legacy fintech banks in the network already that are getting their ability to build their Bitcoin and crypto services, while the old crypto native companies are going to be getting their bank charters. That was the point of Genius Act, to make them banks so that they can join the proof of weapons network and join the system as well. So if you can't beat them, join them. That's why Operation Choke Point 2.0 happened. Anyway, what is going to be happening next? I'm seeing more. I've invested in over 100 companies, and I'm getting more and more knocks of mergers and acquisitions. Personally, I'm taking off all my private equity now that the proof of weapons network is in full force, and I'm converting that into Bitcoin in self-custody whenever liquidity becomes available. So, we sold our operational business to Coinbase. We've got a bunch of assets, and when liquidity becomes available, I'll be converting all that private equity as it becomes public, and then selling it off for dollars, pulling out at dollars and buying Bitcoin in self-custody. And we're seeing mass mergers and acquisitions, which was the goal of Operation Choke Point 2.0, and the tariff policy was to consolidate power up to the largest corporations in a K-shaped economy, and reset the world order so that everybody, the smaller companies, pay the tariff tax, end up going bankrupt and getting gobbled up by the larger companies. And then they're consolidating more and more power as well. Anyway, own Bitcoin in self-custody, simplify your life, own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month, self-custody it, don't worry about price. Whatever happens to the price, the more the price goes down, the more you get to buy with your fiat currency, and you just get to have a peaceful resistance of the proof of weapons network using peaceful proof of work. On X, everyone will be panicking. They'll be telling you it's over, all this type of stuff. Remember, you are in a game for the next 5 years. If you accept this challenge, 4 years, let's say, I've been challenging everyone to 4 years to get as much Bitcoin as you can through your fiat currency, and ending up with Bitcoin in self-custody, and then deciding how you're going to manage things from there. So that is everything for this week in Bitcoin. I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to be moving over to part 2, this week in macro. Now, we've got a lot to cover with this week in macro, because the main subject is we're going to be going through, are these 50-year mortgages a bank bailout, how to utilize them, and also, is there really an AI bubble, and what is actually driving these valuations, and why is there a correction at the moment? So do me a favor. I'm just going to have a little quick sip of water. If you're enjoying this, please retweet it on X, and put a comment in the bottom. Give me a like, and I'll be going straight into this week in macro part 2. Okay, welcome back to Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 106. What is the connection between a 50-year mortgage and Al Qaeda joining the White House? Are we in an AI bubble? And what's driving this stock market correction and valuations at the moment? We're going to be going through all of that. So firstly, let's cover a few news items. What triggered the correction? Everything came off. Long-term rates started going up. It was very similar to Liberation Day, April the 2nd, 2025, when Trump announced and reset the world order for BlackRock and the financial industrial complex. And what did he do? You started to get corrections in the dollar, crashes in the markets. The long-term interest rates started going up. And immediately they had to reverse the policy. They started talking about the trade wars with China, and then you had a massive pump and dump, and then they started to pump liquidity, ease quantitative tightening, push out narratives to reduce rates, start reducing rates, and move closer and closer to quantitative easing, which is probably something we'll be getting very, very soon. And so they will pump liquidity to push the K-shaped economy. So the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Screw the economy is all about the stock market. That's sort of fiscal dominance. The government gets bigger. They roll over the debt. And then they require the interest rates, the short-term interest rates, to be low with the Federal Reserve. So Trump starts pushing, more and more banksters into the Fed. Remember, Trump's paid for the banksters because he's part of the banking lobby, is his main backers, as well as the technical lobby, as well as the Israeli lobby. And so he's enforcing those policies. And then what are they going to do? They'll dump it through deregulation onto your pension and stable coins so that you subsidize the below market rate debt, because they need the American people to do it. That's why you're seeing massive amounts of Cayman Island volume. The largest lender to the US government is Cayman Island, even though they're lending 1.8 trillion on a tiny economy. That's because it's all the hedge funds and the manipulation and all the financial weapons of mass destruction. Most of the countries, their foreign currencies and their foreign stock markets are going up because they're selling their treasuries. The carry trade is being reversed. And we'll go more about this in the geopolitical section when we cover like the Epstein files. Everybody's being pushed in order to make sure that they stay on track to switch the world to this multipolar world order that BlackRock and the financial industrial complex wants to do us. So what does that mean? It means you need to manufacture chaos within America. That is Trump is the agent of chaos for the banksters. And so US went into the longest government shutdown that we've ever seen. People weren't getting paid. People weren't able to collect their benefits. And what was that? What is a government shutdown? Well, firstly, it's nothing to do with paying off the debt. It's nothing to do with fiscal conservatism versus socialism. Both the Democrats and the Republicans are two coins of the same party. What they do is they have a different flavor of how to steal money from Americans and give it over to the banks that pay for them through lobbying. And so what were the Democrats doing? So basically, Trump got the debt ceiling up to $5 trillion. They've now America's pushed to $38 trillion of debt. He got the big, beautiful bill, which is a $1.3 trillion stimulus for the proof of weapons network. And then the Democrats lobby in order to get as much of that money over to the insurance companies, because they say we're looking after the people. We want Obamacare. We want benefits. And who manages it? The insurance companies manage it. That pumps the price of their stocks, which is owned by the same asset managers like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And then they get to manage those benefits, which pumps more and more money over there. Now, on the Republican side, they start fighting with each other. The lobbies control both sides, so it doesn't really matter. But you get to create this illusion that like the left and the right are different. You get to people to buy into it's the Democrats which are creating all this problem with the stock market. And then they get to say it's the Republicans that don't care about the American people when they're all doing identical things with different flavor. What do the Republicans do if they get their way? Well, essentially, they get to pump all the money into the stocks and they get to print just as much because both their job, the uni-party goal, is simply to roll over the debt and push the K-shaped economy so the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. It's just a different way of doing it. The asset managers, they win either way, and they get to, they own shares in the banks as well. And then they can push people into ETFs and this passive investment so that they can make sure that the companies are in line with their agenda and they use those financial weapons of mass destruction. So it's the debt ceiling, which is just simply a mechanism for causing friction to get more and more money stolen to roll over the debt-based Ponzi scheme. That's all a government shutdown means. And so they announced we're now out of the government shutdown. What does this do? It creates a stimulus, but suddenly you get the hedge funds that are going out there and they're a massive synchronized swimming almost. We're in an AI bubble. So you get all these narratives of we're in an AI bubble from all the nodes in the proof of weapons network, all the hedge funds. And suddenly we get a big, big correction, which pays into people's fears. You get the hedge fund vigilantes coming out, and you get all of this different thing. Now, what's happening in the real world? Well, in the real world, you had some of the most important players on the proof of weapons network, like Chevron, who are actually going to be launching artificial intelligence data centers in West Texas that is going to be powered by negative price natural gas. So Chevron are coming after AI. And so we're getting this emergence of energy, artificial intelligence, in order to get all this robotics done. So these are strategically important to the proof of weapons network. Do you really think they're going to just put these things into a bubble? This is strategically important to the proof of weapons network. And so this is a pump and dump in order to get more and more of those stocks consolidated further and further up. And you'll see similar things to what we saw last time. They created a reversal of the Japan carry trade and various other things. Now, what else did we see? Follow the money. We got to follow the real money, not what the narratives. SoftBank, which is a big member of the proof of weapons network in Japan, propping up the Japan carry trade, they actually sold some of their NVIDIA stocks into this high inflated price. They sold their position at about $5.8 billion. What did they buy with that $5.8 billion? They bought OpenAI private stock. Why? Because that's going to IPO later at $1 trillion into the strength of the market. So I'm looking for quantitative easing, reduction of interest rate, rolling over the debt, and they're going to go full-blown money printer in order to make the rich richer, the poor poorer, and pump everything back into the stocks. But they use the hedge funds and market manipulation in order to knock people out along the ways with these different types of crashes. Now, what else did we see? In order to knock this off, we had a big announcement from China. Now, remember, in my map of the world, BlackRock is working with BRICS, China, and the GCC. They're moving the world to a multipolar world order. They're engineering capital outflows, but they're pumping Federal Reserve money and the dollar in order to get more and more extracted to asset strip the American people. China, this is what always causes these pump and dump cycles. China announced that it's going to be expanding its rare earth mineral controls. Now, we know all along, if you're a long-term listener of Bitcoin Hard Talk, that the tariff war was never a real war. China had already won. And this was the execution of the strategy via Liberation Day in order to reset the world order and drive all those flows closer to China, which has the manufacturing base with the energy in the Middle East. And then America's going to be shrunk into a regional power because they no longer need the America and the military industrial complex to create genocide all around the world and kill people and do the covert operations, because now they need regional stability in other regions. They'll do a few more missions in order to knock many of these private companies off, but they're trying to consolidate power as they engineer this shift that we've been talking about in the multipolar world order. But they added 5 new critical elements to this rare earth mineral, game. And that really led to part of the correction. Pick whatever narrative you want. What are those rare earth minerals? It was holmium, it was erbium, thallium, europium, ytterbium. Anyway, the end thing is that America said there are 65 different rare earths that we are dependent upon China for, including the military industrial complex, the technical industrial complex, and the financial industrial complex is manufacturing local wars in order to try and get many of those rare earth minerals and components that they need, because China is essentially, this handover is happening with the global south. They were traditionally creating wars and doing, ISIS insurrections to steal resources in Africa, which was all funded by America. We're going to be going deeper into that in the geopolitical section. If you did not see, I'm going to save it for the geopolitical section. Part 3 is going to be epic. The amount of proof we've now got that ISIS and Al-Qaeda were just simply American missions to steal resources is indisputable and irrefutable now. We'll be covering more of that in part 3. With Giuliani joining Trump in the White House, the ex-Al-Qaeda boss. Anyway, they're tightening the rules on semiconductors and defense use. And so this is how you basically get these pump and dump cycles as well. China wants to work with America. China's already won the trade war, but Trump is there to make Americans think something else is happening in the name of MAGA. It basically gives China more and more of a strategic grip on vital tech minerals, but it also allows the proof of weapons network via the financial industrial complex to try and make some of those distressed acquisitions as they negotiate their position with China, so that they control the entire West, partner with the Gulf countries, and partner with China as well. And so they're strengthening these global supply chain dominance. And it's always been the supply chains where we've had these, different fear campaigns and knocking people off the network as well. Now, obviously, BlackRock knows what's going to happen before it happens. So you get the hedge funds out there that are capitalizing, and then you wipe out the ones that are not part of the group, the non-chosen ones as well. Anyway, we're going to have trade talks, and the trade war is not real. We're not entering into World War III. All of these things are resolving these issues as well. But anyway, we had a massive, the same impact that we had on Liberation Day was the same thing that we had, and gold spiked and silver spiked as well. So we're almost back at the highs of 4,200. I think we had a bit of a correction. But anyway, dollar strategically weakened over time, long-term rates going up, UK is going through the roof, stock markets up. And then these bonds just being used as a weapon to roll over the debt, make the government bigger, hand over all the money to the private corporate sector, vassalize countries further and further and further, and keep utilizing the dollar to create the K-shaped economy while civil unrest is being manufactured. And then we get the rise of other regions with all of these capital outflows that are driving foreign stock markets higher and higher and higher. So anyway, this is all part of what I believe to be the financial industrial complex dollar weakening campaign. As I said, almost all foreign stocks are outperforming the S&P at the moment. And the stock market looks like it's reaching new all-time highs. But if you price it in gold, you'll realize that this is the devaluation of the dollar. That's the trade. We're starting to see less and less because the dollar's being strategically weakened. I think a couple of weeks ago, I talked about the impact on the petrodollar and the depegging. I'll make sure we get a blog on that, just on the depegging and the petrodollar. One of the most important things to track. And I'll make sure we get a blog published next week, because I went into that on a previous episode, and I think it's really worth digging deeper into. I've been publishing blogs where I take out parts, create like AI summaries so that we can have shorter forms, and then you can dig deeper into the longer. We published one on, for example, the 12-day war. I'm going to give you a bit of summary in the geopolitical section. Anyway, sanctions on Iranian oil they're completely failing. They're not working at all. You'll notice across social media, there'll be little talks about what is Iran up to with these oil tankers and stuff. Essentially, the network of BRICS have proven that via China, you can set up these networks where they don't interfere in each other's geopolitics, but they allow for trade to flow, which will be a much, much better, it's a much better of the world. Global hegemon is awful for the world. Dollar dominance has been really, really bad for so many countries. But now when we move to multipolarity and competition, we're seeing that you can have these different trade flows without countries having to blow each other up in order to eliminate competition. It's about building up, which is why I'm very, very bullish of where this actually goes. But I just know because the proof of weapons network controls the West, it's bleak for the West, as when you follow the monetary flows. They ain't going to tell you that. But also sanctions on Russia. The gas, it's just not working anymore. Europe is still dependent upon it. Imports are still flowing. They're pretending that America is sanctioning US. They're pretending that they're sanctioning Russia. Europe is pretending they're sanctioning Russia. But that BRICS network has been created. The debt to GDP in Russia is going down. The economy's going stronger. It's got the wartime economy, but it's subsidized through the BRICS relationships as well. And so they've unified around de-dollarization and partnered with the Gulf countries. And now Iran, through China, is now normalized with Saudi Arabia, which historically was the destabilization campaign. Now that doesn't exist. You're starting to see all of these different moves. But anyway, Iran, basically their exports of oil hit their highest level since 2018. You started to see some escalations with Russia in Kiev. Save that one for the geopolitical stuff. It's absolute tragedy what's happening in Ukraine. Essentially, BlackRock is acquiring more and more land. Russia's going to end up with more and more land. and the proof of weapons network doesn't care about Ukrainian lives, as it just pushes out useful idiots that think that they're defending democracy, while the military industrial complex is getting more and more to pump into the stock market. All this to say is that the whole climate change narrative, the whole peak oil narrative, suddenly they've disappeared, because the whole goal is artificial intelligence, energy, rare earth minerals, semiconductor chips, because the goal is to replace all jobs with robotics and artificial intelligence, and that requires AI chips. That's the transition that you need to be protecting yourself. So the whole narrative of peak oil, the FUD around that is completely disappeared right now, because they're pushing energy. The whole ESG thing, that was just a BlackRock way of redistributing. Only China was building renewable energy because they are actually using renewable energy. In terms of in Europe, it was just to destroy the European economy, cut off its gas, using its its relationship with its reliance on Russia through Germany, knock off those nodes, and now they're complete vassal states as well. And ESG has always been a narrative to redirect capital flows. They made trillions of dollars off it. But now suddenly no one's talking about climate change, and no one's talking about ESG, and no one's talking about peak oil, because these are just narratives in order to reset capital flows. Right. Everything is about AI, energy, and data. Data centers are going to be geopolitically prioritized over everything. And so the real narrative came out this week in order to correct the stock market, because the valuations of AI dependent companies, whether it be military AI through Palantir, whether it be NVIDIA through data centers, whether it be others, there was a real AI bubble narrative that was pushed out. Now, the guy from The Big Short that shorted, predicted the global financial crisis, got a Hollywood production and made his name for it, Michael Burry, he basically just bet $1.1 billion that the AI revolution is a complete lie. Now, it's not that the technology is a lie, it's that he believes that the valuation is a lie. About 80% of his entire portfolio basically now sits on put options against NVIDIA and Palantir. And then he had a capitulation where he basically quit the game, published out a letter, and everyone was talking about it because he got the short. And now I think he's saying, I don't get these markets. Nothing makes sense. I saw the one in the global financial crisis, but there's nothing that's moving in line with that. What it is that he didn't predict is corruption. The fact that the Fed owns everything and we privatize the losses and socialize the gains. And so you can be right in your analysis, but they don't realize how centralized, fraudulent, and ridiculous the dollar proof of weapons network is. He thinks it's still capitalism. And so therefore he uses the types of tools that we were taught when I did my degree in economics and I did my financial planning qualifications. And when I worked in investment banking, I worked on the trading side and the corporate finance side. We used to use, PE ratios. We used to use things that would have the asset values. And we used to use these things to value companies. But people basically are still in that old paradigm, because that was how we used to push out these analysts that would create buy, sell, hold recommendations. And then we could use those in order to push people into markets and do all sorts of stuff. And so these were the previous tools that Wall Street would use. But now the investment paradigm is basically completely shifted. It's not about market rationality. It's not about any of these things. It's not about earnings per share. It's not about any of these different types of tools that would be used by financial analysts. And interestingly, they had a chartered financial analyst that was kicking people off the CFA network because they were told that they have to treat fiat currencies as non-volatile and that Bitcoin is too volatile. Where the CFA was trying, I posted it on my X, the CFA qualified person in the Chartered Financial Analyst Institute, they were telling that you're not allowed to recommend Bitcoin because it's too volatile. Anyway, what are the key things that actually determine the valuations in a market where the proof of weapons network has fully vassalized all the governments? Well, it's actually about privatizing assets that give the proof of weapons network monopoly and critical control over infrastructure and geopolitical rails and strategic choke points. And so they will never let NVIDIA, be taken down, because this has proven to be a very important way of getting data centers built geopolitically and geostrategically, not for the country, but for the proof of weapons network. They need NVIDIA to be building them around the world. And so they basically create, as I've always said, financial weapons of mass destruction. And if the company does not play along, then they can collapse the share price. And the stock, will continue to go up if they play ball. And so now you've entered into this world where essentially share price is based upon your compliance with the proof of weapons network, which requires you to borrow against your stock so that they can issue you, and the richest people in the world turn them into blackmail and debt slaves in order to fulfill their agenda, so that then they can say, well, we'll take out your net worth based upon levering up, as they do with all these different entrepreneurs at the moment. And so the share price is based upon compliance with the proof of weapons network. That was what ESG was. It was comply with our requirements and you'll get access to the capital. Don't comply, you won't get access to the capital. It will cost you your share price. It will cost you your net worth. And we need you in debt by borrowing against your stock. The same thing they're doing to you by getting you to borrow against your Bitcoin so that you custody it with them. And then they issue you debt so that they can wipe you off the network when they need to, when they want to centralize a bit more of those weapons. And so if anyone defies, like maybe, I don't know, but maybe Elon Musk wasn't meant to talk about the Epstein list. Maybe he went rogue. Maybe it was a wild card. But when he did talk about it, the Tesla price went down. And so they can engineer compliance, because who's on the Epstein list? Well, it's the banksters. It's the technical industrial companies. It's the Peter Thiels. It's the Bill Gates. It's the Jamie Dimons. It's the JP Morgans. It's the Lex Wexners. It's the donor class. It's the lobbies. Everyone's waiting for some Hollywood movie. They care about the celebrities, but we've covered this. Anyway, I'll go more about that in the geopolitical section. So maybe Elon went off script to try and get some more power with the network. His share price comes down and he then doesn't get his share options. They could bribe the court or whatever it is with his salary case at the moment, but they can knock you off the network in these, in the proof of weapons network. And then they can signal, get in shape or we'll make Larry Ellison the richest person. And he's going to be given TikTok. Now you need to make sure that we can use X for everybody's social credit score. And we're going to make sure that only Larry Ellison via Oracle gets the TikTok US arm, so that he can build out our algorithm for manufacturing civil unrest or political goals or knocking people off the network, destroying their reputations in these blackmail rings. But if you defy, then your stock price gets tanked and you're in leverage. And so you have to comply. And that's essentially the mafia of the proof of weapons network. And that was all done through this privatization, securitization, and financialization. And that's the Oracle and Tesla example that you're seeing. Now, people have so much faith in the system, they think it's about earnings per share. And so they're using old analysis rather than following geopolitics. And I've always said, follow the money. It's why whenever I used to go on those spaces with all the traditional analysts, they just call me a conspiracy theory and say, no, the world doesn't work that way. And they would look at the traditional, but that's why I always spend my time on following the money, because it helps you see past media narratives. Media is what they want you to believe. Remember, in the Financial Times, it's not truth. It's what the banks want you to believe and where they want you to flow your capital. It's just signal. And they kind of use news stories and earnings per share and the traditional. You need to understand how the financial industrial complex works. These different types of, not these different types of matrices. And that's why we'll always be following the money, and we combine the Bitcoin side, the macro side, with the most important geopolitical side, because markets are driven now by geopolitics, which is controlled by the proof of weapons network. So anyway, at the moment, AI is about their long-term control. And so, you know, they want control over some of the regional blocks wherever they can, BRICS, GCC. But they also need these companies in order to negotiate. So the reason, you know, Trump is executing the Gulf plan with the financial industrial complex is because they want to build those data centers and they want to get access to those nuclear energy. And so by controlling these $5 trillion companies, that is their leverage point in negotiating these blocks when they move to the multipolar world order, which they're engineering, just like you witnessed with the pound. You know, the Bank of England bankrupted the UK government and then engineered the pound into a regional currency from global reserve currency, and then took all the gold and put it in the American empire, and then needed the wars in order to reset the world order. So anyway, stocks like Nvidia, Oracle, Meta, these are strategically important companies. And so they're saying AI bubble. Yes, you'll get market manipulations, but they need these companies for as long as possible because they are geopolitically and strategically important for the proof of weapons network to negotiate with the regional blocks. And these corporate entities is what they need, is where they get their leverage from in order to negotiate the system. So anyway, what does this mean? It means that they're essentially immune from poor financial performance. So whatever they do, whatever they say, it doesn't really matter because they're relevant. And so they will protect the share price. So how do they protect the share price? Well, they protect the share price in the debt-based Ponzi scheme by printing money. And so that's why we're going to move over to quantitative easing, because the stock market can't go down, because who's the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve pretends it's about inflation and employment, but who are the shareholders of the Federal Reserve? The banks. The banks that control the lobby that control the politicians, Senate, Congress, and can bribe through their black op operations, judicial as well. And so the money printer turns on, and that's how you protect the share price. So the money printer will turn on until you can't roll over, and they're hedging in other markets as well. And gold and Bitcoin is the liquidity sponge in these transitions for different people on the network. And so the Fed has to keep interest rates down. It's not because Trump's forcing them down. It's because the banks want them down, and they need a narrative to make it look like Trump's taking on the banks while he works for the banks. And so they need to buy more bonds buy more bonds in order to make money cheaper. And when money is cheaper, that means that the stocks go up, but only the stocks that are strategically important. The other get wrecked by the hedge funds. So it's about consolidating power. The second thing, what do? Well, they use the index funds. There's a reason why BlackRock in the 2008 financial crisis took out Barclays iShares, because they want the ETFs. The ETFs are about using the insurance markets, the pension markets, the endowment markets, and various other cash flows from retail investors to invest in their index funds so that they end up with the board sheet, they end up with the voting rights, they end up with the largest shareholding for the ETF, and then they can determine through S&P what gets in. And they can knock people off the S&P or knock them in the S&P depending on compliance and strategic importance. Now, once you're in the S&P, you get the passive income, which means everybody gets forced to buy those stocks through these passive pension funds and vehicles. They can't leave. They can only leave if they get knocked off the network. And so this is what the S&P 500 and the index funds are all about. Is basically forced to buy more, and the stock goes up. So you've got money printing, then you've got the index funds, And then you've got basically a one-way facet of dollar printing into the stock market with the K-shaped economy. What's the third thing they can do? Basically, bad news gets ignored. They can control the media, and they can use market manipulation in order to correct the price and pump the price using the hedge fund network that we covered. So it really doesn't matter whether there's missed earnings or anything like that, good earnings, bad earnings, whether there's a drop in sales, an increase in sales. Is just geopolitically and strategic importance, and making sure anyone that has a choke point will be important. That's why X is important. That's why XAI is important. That's why OpenAI is important. That's why these different choke points. That's why the phones with Microsoft, the computers, with Microsoft and various other Apple and various other things. Okay, right. Now, how are you going to roll over the network? So we're starting to see real signs of liquidity distress within the banking market as well. That's another fear factor that's being pushed into it. This is to drive us to lower rates, quantitative easing, and pump up the stock market, but knock some people off the network as it goes. And then those index funds will kick in and money printing will kick in. So what did we get an announcement of? Trump decided he's got to float a 50-year mortgage. So let's go into the 50-year mortgage and tie this all together. So the narrative is that it's going to help young people in order to get access to affordable housing. This is what was done by Franklin D. Roosevelt after the Roaring 20s, the stock market crash, and the Great Depression. It had gold confiscation, and then they increased the mortgages to 30-year mortgage. And the narrative, of course, was that it helped millions of Americans in order to afford more homes and get out of the Great Depression. So they stimulated the Great Depression with the debt-based Ponzi scheme. The debt has gone up and up and up. Now America's 38 trillion. So you create war, you create stimulus through real estate, and then the banks get to create more dollars every time they issue a loan. The interest to pay off the debt doesn't exist, so you need to keep rolling it over. So what does this actually mean? So let's say you took out a $400,000 mortgage, and it would be, for a 50-year, you'd imagine that it would be at about 7% interest. Because the longer the duration of the mortgage, the higher the interest has to, be. But you can spread it out over 50 years, so your monthly payment is lower. It means that you just pay interest for an incredibly long time, and you spread it out over your whole life, and you work for the bank for your whole life. Now, some people will say, yeah, but I don't want the duration of the whole mortgage. I just want the lower payment now. That's the carrot. And the stick is that you end up enslaved to the bank. Now, under a 30-year mortgage, if you were to buy that house, that $400,000 house, you would basically pay $558,000 in your lifetime interest. So you pay over the value of the house over 30 years. So $558 in interest, $400,000 in your house. And you hope that over 30 years, because it's a debt-based Ponzi scheme backed by real estate, that the value of your house over that 30 years is a lot more. And if it beats inflation, then you roll over the debt and you keep pushing out equity in order to refinance. The bank gets all their interest and they keep rolling over. And if ever they get it wrong, like they did in 2007, 2008, then the government bails them out, socialize the losses, socialize the losses and privatize the gains. Now, let's say you got the same house, but you did it with a 50-year. Under a 50-year, by adding the additional 20 years, you pay $1.16 million in lifetime interest, which means that your $400,000 house costs you about $1.6 million with a 50-year mortgage. You basically pay double the amount of interest that you would have paid if you were under a 30-year mortgage. So you're rolling out, and you're giving people relief by having a lower payment up front. This turns basically a 50-year mortgage, and you get to push out the narrative, because what are people going to do with that? Well, the real savvy people are going to take the savings and buy assets. Almost everyone else is going to buy groceries, and those groceries are going to be bought on credit cards. So you're paying interest on interest on interest, and the K-shaped economy gets worse and worse and worse. but it gives them a little bit of relief so that they can use you to roll over the debt-based Ponzi scheme a little bit worker. But it looks like a gift, and that gift is leading into the midterm elections. And so it's not a gift. It looks like a gift. It can be a gift if you understand how the monetary flows work. But it's basically a $1 trillion bailout for Wall Street and the banks, dressed up as if it's some kind of tax cut. So let's look at that. So basically, the banks and the hedge funds are drowning in these mortgages that they did when it was the interest rates were locked in at approximately 2 to 3%, these old mortgages. And they basically got all these 2 to 3% mortgages, which is, potentially could wipe out some banks if there's any liquidity issues. But what would save them? If they could roll them over at 6 to 7% interest. And basically these old loans, they're worth, if you look at this, about 50 to 60 cents on the dollar. I got this example from Evan on X, and I'll put some links in the blog as well. But basically, they're now sitting on $1 to $2 trillion across the banking system in these types of mortgages, and they're losing losses. They're getting their losses, and you could just basically wipe out. And so this is a banker's bonus. This is 100%. If this goes through, I'm not sure if it goes through, but this is definitely a proof of weapons network initiative marketed by Trump for the financial industrial complex. And maybe they're looking at taking Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, making them public, merge them in, roll over, get the government to socialize the losses, construct some 50-year treasuries, see if they can get the demand there. I'm not sure where the demand's going to come for a 50-year government treasury to offset it. But anyway, these are the types of things that they're looking to do that. You could have banks wiped out if they don't with these different things. So it is a bank bailout by doing this. Yeah. Anyway, if you can get everyone over to a 50-year mortgage, they can refinance at the higher rates. They can be stuck in loans. They can then put it through the financial industrial complex, put it into mortgage-backed securities, roll it up, and BlackRock and PIMCO and all of the other parts of the financial industrial complex and the big banks, they can instantly basically get hundreds of billions of dollars with no work. So this is beautiful for them. Basically, you pay interest for 50 years if you actually want to own this whole house. Your kids basically end up, because most people, in the 50 years, it will pass on to their kids. They'll still be paying the debts. You're passing on to your grandchildren and the next generation or intergenerational mortgages. It could move over to 100-year. It could move over to lifetime mortgages if they can get this right. And sometimes you can never actually move or change jobs easily because basically breaking a 50-year loan comes with a massive, cost. And they basically, if you pay it off early or you move or you do any of that, there's a massive penalty for paying off early because they factor that into the equation. And so in some cases, you can't even move. And that's where people are right now. They can't move even though they want to because they're locked into their mortgages. And if they remortgage it, they'll be paying at the highest rate. So this is kind of closer to a form of debt slavery that the Federal Reserve always wanted to create it when the banks created this model and made the dollar a debt-based Ponzi scheme based upon what they did in the UK. Anyway, your house doesn't get any cheaper. If you want to actually deal with affordable housing, you make houses cheaper. That's the real way to do it. But the banking system is backed by housing, and that has to go up, and they have to roll over the debt because it's a debt-based Ponzi scheme. And that's why the proof of weapons network is hedging into multipolarity, because the writing's on the wall for how long they can do this. They'll do it for as long as they can, but they've got to hedge and make sure that when they're ready, the Fed for the banks can just rug pull the system, and normally they'd want to do a managed transition, but they'll keep juicing it until there's civil unrest. Hence, you got the surveillance state, AI, robotics, and all those other things that are strategically important for the goals. So prices continue to skyrocket for real estate, which is what the banks need, is what the individuals need. But now you got, basically a 50-year mortgage, which means a bigger loan, and first-time buyers still, get crushed. You just got to pay a higher price. They won't let the real estate market crash because they can't move to deflation. The only deflation they can do is AI and oil prices, but we're starting to see that the oil strategic reserves, the strategic petroleum reserves for America, are really, really low right now. Now they're doing drill, baby, drill, but if the prices go down, that will create bankruptcies, consolidation of power up to Chevron, Exxon. What about AI? That's how you end up with robotics, AI. So of course, they're not going to allow this to reflect earnings per share. They need to pump the AI bubble. They need to keep it going. And they will socialize the losses and privatize the gain. It is illegal for these stocks to go down long term. So we will move into QA and you will pay it if you don't own those assets. BlackRock and Wall Street will undergo a massive bailout paid for by Main Street. It's 2008 again, and the stocks will pump. And this is why, people that traditionally are looking for their big short or something, they fail to recognize how fraudulent, centralized, and unethical the market has actually become. Mortgage companies will basically collect 50 years of servicing fees. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they'll be merged, put into an IPO. More of it will float. And then you can privatize, the gains, but socialize the losses. You put it in the index fund, it will be controlled by BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And now you got the banks, the real estate, the technical industrial complex, the military industrial complex. And this is further, and the government is the piggy bank that's getting bigger and bigger and deeper into debt, but you're not even getting any of that money reinvested into infrastructure or Americans or anything. And of course, Trump looks like a hero because he's delivering the narrative and basically the biggest wealth transfer from the average American people over to billionaires in history. And people will cheer it on. Now, what is the hack? People will say, well, I can pay off faster by investing in assets because I've got a lower monthly cost. And they'll use that. And that is actually true. And so that is the hack. But what is this system? The system is that they're trying to draw you into the system of in-debt slavery. So you continue to pay the interest. You continue to have the high penalty fee if your assets outstrip. You continue to use the ATM. And then you get them to manage your money in order to try and outperform the interest that you're paying. So obviously, the right thing to do if you're savvy is to save the money and then invest it in assets so that you can outperform inflation and you can get yourself out of the hamster wheel. But this is using leverage. Obviously, that's the hack. So, of course, the hack also serves Wall Street. So either way, what they really don't want you doing, though, is basically they want you to invest. They don't want you to invest the difference in Bitcoin unless it's via the ETF. So then they can use it to get a JP Morgan loan to pay off your long-term loan, lever up further, and use their financial weapons of mass destruction. This is the centralized Bitcoin industrial complex that they're building, and you combat it by owning it in self-custody. So you could take on the debt, reduce the rate, and then buy Bitcoin in self-custody. That's what they don't want you to do. That's why they got Genius Act and Clarity Act and all those other things. So let's give an example. I'll just give an example. I got this from somebody on X as well. I'll try and give credit in the blog as well. But basically, monthly payments, imagine you're paying a 6% interest on a 500K home. Now, if you had a 30-year mortgage, you would be paying $2,997.75. Now, let's say instead you elected to roll over into a 50-year mortgage. Now, I don't know what the rate will be, but let's assume it's a similar rate. Then you will have $2,632. And the monthly difference is approximately $365.73. So the total interest that you'll be paying on a 30-year interest is $579,190.95. So let's say $580,000 is the total interest you pay on buying a $500,000 house. But if you now do it under a 50-year interest, you pay over $1 million, $1,079,000. So you pay double the amount of interest, but now you get the lower payment up front. Now, the extra interest from choosing the 50-year option is approximately $500,000. So you're paying double in that example. But if you're structuring the loan under 50 years, you pay the extra $500,000 in interest. So that goes to the bank. The bank obviously loves it. That's the bank bailout. But if you take that basically $365 of interest that you save, and you basically get that monthly saving because you're spreading it over 50 years rather than 30 years. And let's say you decided to invest it into Bitcoin and self-custody, which is what they don't want you to do. Now, they don't mind you doing it because they get a higher interest, but also you escape the system. Now, few will do this. This may end up that you end up a high net worth investor. And that's how you end up on the right side of the proof of weapons network. Now, they'd rather you do it through their stocks so they control you. But again, I can't promise what will happen to Bitcoin. I just know that I will buy it every single month, and I think it will outperform most markets over a 4-year cycle if you dollar cost average and ignore the price. Now, conservatively, some people say that, a CAGR, which is a compounded annual growth rate, in Bitcoin is estimated to be 20% for 30 years. I said, not financial advice, forward-looking statement. Do your own research. You decide whether that will happen. I believe that's pretty conservative, and I believe that can continue to happen. Now, what this would mean over that 30 years is that you end up, if it goes at 20% and you just invest the difference, your Bitcoin at the end of the 30 years would be worth $8.4 million. So the trade-off is basically you pay the bank $500K more, and they know this. So this is what the smart people will be doing, but they know what everyone else will be doing, and they win either way. This is why it's a bank bailout. So you pay $500K additional in interest, but you end up with, if that 20% model happens, and it won't go like that, as I said, not financial advice, do your own research, you make your own projections, but you'd end up with $8.4 million in Bitcoin. Now, even if the compounded annual growth rate, the CAGR of the BTC, of the Bitcoin, it gets you basically $1 million status. So you become a millionaire after 18 years, and you get to escape the proof of weapon network, become an accredited investor, and all those different things. And so that's just with the additional contribution by rolling it over. And of course, they know that. They know that. And so the system is enslave. The solution is Bitcoin in self-custody, if it works that way. That's what you have to do, I guess, if you're in this situation. Now, if you're a long-term listener, you won't need to do that because you built the wealth effect. You've been buying Bitcoin every month, and you're able to boycott the system without the debt. But I recognize that this is about practicality and reality. And so I just wanted to give the example of what people will be doing to escape the system. This is basically a 50-year mortgage and instead of 30 years. And you basically get to stack 365 more per month in Bitcoin, that if it does compound at 20% annually for 50 years, your final stack could become, so if you did it for the whole 50 years rather than 30 years, in that scenario, and this is crazy, I just want to give you the number to highlight what long-term planning is. It won't work like this, but I just want you to get into the habit of buy every month regardless of price. But if you did it for the whole 50 years and invested that, and it did get the 20% return, in 50 years from now, you'd have $445 million. And everyone else is focusing on gambling on shitcoins and crypto. And this is the importance of long-term thinking and understanding and working through follow the money. And but everyone wants to get rich quick. And this is why you got to start with that 4-year, buy Bitcoin each month, regardless of price. And get a little bit smarter. And hopefully you don't need to do it with the 50-year mortgage. I don't know whether this is going to happen or not. But they want you to invest the difference with them. And so the boycott is do it in self-custody. And you don't make them more powerful. And hopefully it outperforms the interest and you can play the game that they know you're going to play. Obviously, you're paying interest to the bank, so it's not a full boycott. You know what my ideal is, but this is just about being better given your current circumstance rather than perfection. We don't not do things because we're not getting it perfect. Okay. Now, I just want to give the other side of this. Most people just won't do that. We know what most people are going to do. The vast majority will roll over their debt, take on the 50-year mortgage. They'll pay the additional interest to the bank. They'll be in debt slave for the rest of their life. They'll pass on the debt to their children, to potentially to their grandchildren. And what they're going to do with the difference, they'll receive some relief, which is what the original purpose is. And then they'll use that to consume, or they'll pay off some of their credit cards, or they'll just consume on more credit cards. So they'll spend their entire lives rolling over their debt and their children's lives, pass on the debt in there, and basically working for banks forever. And so while you may get your freedom of speech and believe you've got freedom, remember the Constitution didn't protect you. It protected you from the tyranny of government. But who were the people, who were the founding fathers? They were the banks at the times, the elites at the time, the landowners, the corporate class of today. And so they didn't protect you from the tyranny of the government being controlled by the elites and the corporations. And so now you got covert enslavement via debt slavery. And that was always the game. That's always been the central banking game. So the only rational option, as we see, is to invest the difference. They prefer you to do it in the S&P 500 so that they can give themselves more power through these index funds in order to build the proof of weapons network. And if you are going to go to gold, they want you to do it via their gold ETF. And if you are going to go to Bitcoin, they want you to go via their Bitcoin. Your job is to do it in self-custody, of course. It will always be a bank bailout. This is how you socialize the losses and privatize the gains, whether you get a massive systemic risk event. It will always be done this way because that's the nature of the debt-based Ponzi scheme, because the government is the banks. They're owned by the banks, and no one's bigger than that. And 95% of people will just take the extra payment. Maybe they'll use it in order to try and pay down some of their mortgage and get more equity in it. But we know what's going to happen. The prices are going to go up. They're going to lie to you about consumer price inflation. And in 18 to 24 months, something's going to come up. Maybe you don't get your Medicare. Maybe you don't, whatever it is. You get some kind of tragedy that means you need to pay for a hospital bill. Maybe there's something that the kids need to pay for. Maybe there's the college. Maybe there's the new car that you need to get. And maybe there's a medical bill. And that's what 95% of people are going to do. So it is 100% a bank bailout. It is to refinance those 2 to 3% mortgages and get them at 6 to 7%. Get a small percentage of people utilizing it for Bitcoin and self-custody and beating the proof of weapons network. But virtually everyone will not pay down more of their equity and end up right back at the same thing where they're just paying the interest and paying the minimum they can because inflation won't take over, and then they'll refinance their house and use it as their ATM. And so if you've got a 400K house, you're buying it for $1.6 million. Trump gets to say this is a solution for affordable rather than dealing with the root cause of the problem, which is that you need house prices to reflect reality of wages. And that's why they tell you the stock market and GDP is their measure of success and whether we're in a recession. It's a hidden recession. It's a covert Great Depression. And it's most people that are impacted by it, while Trump tells you this is the best economy ever. And anyway, we don't know what the rate will be on the 50-year mortgage. It's probably going to be something like 7 to 8.5%. Who knows? Because, you know, if you asking the banks to take longer duration risk, they basically have to do a higher rate and they have to come up with another product, and then they'll have to create some kind of way of doing it. Why? Because you might pass away, you might default, your house could get flooded, there could be a natural disaster. So they have to charge a higher rate, so it will come with a higher rate. Or it will be subsidized by the government, which is essentially socialism under the Republican Party for the rich and banks. That's always been the game. The banks get socialism, and you get to defend and say, don't give me any money because that's communism and socialism. So you get the worst of both worlds. You don't even get the benefits from the money printing unless you can play this game, which most people aren't playing the game. This is generational debt, and a 50-year mortgage, you know, it's a loan. It's a lifetime submission to Wall Street. You don't own the house. The whole time you have a mortgage, the bank owns you and they own the house. And it's for half a century. As I said, the solution is to make houses affordable again, but you know, the only way to actually do that, the only way they can do that instead, they'll just stretch the term and keep the price going up. That's just the reality. If they actually wanted affordable housing, what would they do? Well, there's $2 trillion of mortgage-backed securities on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. They would continue into quantitative tightening and sell down, and that would drive the price down. BlackRock is buying it up through mortgage-backed securities via your ETF. You see why I say boycott the system, because you're perpetuating the system, which is causing this late enslavement. And so if you really wanted to solve affordable housing, you just end the commoditization. You end the mortgage-backed security. You end using pensions via index funds to invest in these investment banking products, which brings us back to Michael Berry, because he saw where the mortgage-backed securities and the credit default swaps and what happened. He shorted, but he didn't predict that the extent of the corruption and socialization of the losses and privatization of the gain. So that is never going to happen. And this is why the game is Bitcoin in self-custody. The real estate is the backbone of the debt-based Ponzi scheme. And so what is Trump going to do as we move to this potential universal basic income? He's going to roll it over into stable coins, deregulate to dump more onto your pension, force you into it, maybe create the 50-year treasury product if he can find the demand. Where's the demand going to come from? Maybe they'll just stick it in your pension, whatever they can do, and they'll get you to subsidize the low rate, which is why they want to pump down the short-term rate, which subsidizes the debt on the long term and the short term. And so the banks will be figuring out what they're going to do in all of that. But what did Trump do anyway? What did he announce? $2,000 tariff dividend for all Americans right before the midterm election. How's this going to be funded? Well, Trump said that it's going to be funded by U.S. tariff revenues. It's complete deceit, complete lie. We know that the debt's going up. In order to have world reserve currency, Triffin's dilemma, you have to have a twin fiscal deficit and trade deficit. And all that's doing is the deficit's going up to roll over the debt. And nothing stops this train. So it's not funded by tariffs, because although money is coming in, there's $350 billion approximately that has come in. But remember who paid it? American business, which is sending American business into mergers and acquisitions. And the large companies, which will be able to offset the tariffs, they're buying the export distressed companies into the proof of weapons network and driving the world over to China and BRICS. And that was always the goal. That was always the goal. So what did we do? I'll just give the quote. So Trump comes out on Truth Social, his social network, and said that the US is collecting trillions of dollars in tariffs. They're not collecting trillions of dollars. There hasn't been trillions of dollars in tariff. And that they will use the trillions of dollars of money to reduce the national debt. They can't pay off the national debt. That would collapse the entire economy. It's a debt-based Ponzi scheme, and reward its citizens. It's not going to reward its citizens. It's going to create inflation. It will be paid for by debt, and it will reward the banks. And it's a stimmy check, a stimulus of the market that will create inflation, that will wreck those in debt in the short term. And he said it's going to be excluding high income earners. Fine. Okay. Then you should exclude the high income earners. That's the first thing he said, truthful, if he ends up doing it, but they're getting the stimulus check from their stocks. He did this during COVID. This happened during COVID under Biden as well. So Trump called tariff. Basically, he then started talking about the tariff critics, and he said that they are fools, and claimed that the US is now the richest, most respected country in the world. And what did he do to use that metric? He cited their stock market. And so the stock market is the only metric: fiscal dominance, larger government, debt-based Ponzi scheme, roll over the debt, push it into stocks, and then 401k values go up. And then they can dump more of those low paying treasuries and various other weapons that they're doing, and the private equity, of course, as well. I personally believe that if this $2,000 does actually happen, it will maybe be done via a stable coin, hence the crypto policy. That's a bit of speculation on my behalf. Why wouldn't they? And it basically becomes a universal basic income beta test for the stable coin surveillance state as these trends push forward. So I wonder if it will be paid by a stable coin. That would be very interesting. That's why you're getting Clarity and Genius Act. But what are they actually doing? They're inflating away the debt through fiscal dominance with a MAGA sticker on top of it, wrecking Main Street and handing over to Wall Street with a bank bailout and fiscal dominance and pumping up the stock prices. But I don't know if this will actually happen, because it actually requires congressional approval. And my understanding of US politics is it probably won't pass. So it's just something that they're saying, and then maybe MAGA people are saying it like it's happening. So it may be just a political maneuver. But then that brings us into the interms and the fact that maybe you can never get any of these policies actually through, because if the interms doesn't go in favor of the Trump administration, then it's never going to happen. And MAGA maybe start spending it like it's going to happen, believing that they're going to get their $2,000 relief. That was the promise under Doge. And Doge was just a mechanism for getting all of that data into the social credit score, handing it over to Palantir, handing it over to the artificial intelligence algorithms, and weakening the dollar. So that's what really is going to happen when you follow the money. We covered a lot of ground in This Week in Macro. We covered whether there's an artificial intelligence bubble, whether this will lead to a stock market recovery, whether the 50-year bailout was a bailout for the banks, and how to think about valuations and what the key metrics are in This Week in Macro. So I hope you enjoyed that. And now we're going to tie it all together. If you watch This Week in Bitcoin, you can see the technical side that's happening. Then we covered This Week in Macro, the 50 years. And now I'm going to make a very strange connection In This Week in Geopolitics, I'm going to be covering how we get from 9/11 to the head of Al Qaeda being in the White House, and what's happening right now on the geopolitical side, and how that actually relates to understanding how to follow the money in macro via geopolitics. Because the traditional analysis that Wall Street are using no longer works. So I'm going to take a quick sip of water. And then what I'd love for you to do is, while I'm doing that, put a comment below, retweet, please share. I rely upon your traffic in order to do this. Also, follow me on Rumble. If you want to download these things, because it's too much in one go, I know I drop a lot on you. I break it down, I upload them to YouTube. You can also download them on Spotify or Apple iTunes. And also, I back everything up on simondixon.com. And also, if you'd like a free membership to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal, it's completely free. You can get a free digital copy of my book, a backup of all the content in case we get banned, and also a completely free course on Bitcoin and self-custody. No sponsorship, no upsell, no agenda, no sponsors, no monetization. Just building a community of people that are going to own more Bitcoin this month than the next month, and are really analyzing the geopolitics so that we can have better access to information. Also, follow me on X if you want the real-time updates. And then we're going to move over, and I'll be back very shortly in a second with This Week in Geopolitics. Okay, welcome back to part 3 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 106, This Week in Geopolitics. The title of this episode is, how do 50-year mortgages, will there be 50-year mortgages, and how do they connect to the fact that we got the Al Qaeda boss in the White House right now having dinner with the Trump administration and Donald Trump himself. And in part 3, we're going to be doing This Week in Geopolitics. We've already done in part 2 the 50-year mortgage, and we covered all the technology that's been built in the Bitcoin section. In this section, we're going to be giving you the resources. I released a new blog this week, and I'd really love you to watch a documentary by Ryan Dawson, which I think is absolutely brilliant. I've watched the whole thing. I think it's the best piece of work out there. I'll give you a link on my blog, and I can share some details. But I'll also give you a bit of a summary with AI in this section. So I'm going to be giving the update of This Week in Geopolitics, and then we're going to watch a couple of clips, and then we're going to move over to an AI summary. In case you can't watch that documentary, we created a summary that breaks it down in a more manageable, shorter form, because the whole documentary, I give a 70-minute intro myself and then 4 hours. I really recommend watching it. Once you understand this, you understand the world, then you can follow the money and you cannot be fooled by the media and all the tricks that are happening. So we're going to be covering right now from 9/11 to the White House. So let's go through some of my longer term predictions and some of the different things that happened this week to see how I'm doing on my predictions. What I tend to do is review it, predict what I think is coming next, tell you where I'm wrong, and then show you what I think I'm following so you can start to do the same. So this week, there was a meeting between Israel president, prime minister or president? I'm not sure. One of them, Netanyahu. Anyway, Satanyahu. He met with Kushner. Now, you know my view. Satanyahu doesn't work for the Israel. He works for the military-industrial complex, and Israel is a covert colony. We'll go a little bit more into that. And who is Kushner? Jared Kushner is Trump's son-in-law, and Trump's son-in-law set up Affinity Partners Fund, which was funded by Saudi Arabia, and that $2 billion will be invested in the region in order to bribe Trump into regional stability under Gulf terms in the Middle East. And Trump is negotiating for the financial industrial complex and the proof of weapons network and the GCC and their sovereign wealth funds as well. So Netanyahu met with Kushner, and that will be discussing the Gaza situation. Now, the traditional narrative that people push out there is Israel rules the world. You know that I believe that's plausible deniability to fool the Americans so that America and the dollar and the proof of weapons network can say that was Israel that did that genocide. and they can say they control us and they bribed us because we're the ethical people that get bribed by those pesky Jews, and they push out anti-Semitism and Muslim hatred in order to perpetuate the narrative and the civil unrest campaign. But really, I believe that we're moving towards regional stability. What they're discussing is the fact that there has to be the occupation ending, Arab security, but there's going to be the relevant power brokers that are going to switch from working for the military industrial complex, are going to work for the financial industrial complex in order to achieve, because you can't get inbound investment if you don't have peace. Your insurance premiums are too high if there's rockets going. And so everything's about getting those insurance premiums down, stable investment environment, and who needs to be paid off in order to get this deal done. And Netanyahu, he's protecting himself because he doesn't want to go to prison for all the crimes against humanity he committed. And the military companies want plausible deniability because they don't want to pay and be sued for the genocide that they committed. And again, I talk about these very passively. I have a humanitarian hat and a follow the money hat. The follow the money hat is my investment banker hat, where I just talk about things as I see them, as they are. The humanitarian hat is heartbroken by what's actually happening. And you'll see me and I'll tell you when I'm putting down the hat or putting on the different things. But the US is basically pushing right now for a deal where basically Hamas needs to put down their weapons in exchange for some kind of amnesty, some kind of exile. We started to see weird things with planes that were taking off, with people leaving. And basically the tunnels need to be removed because in order to get stable investment, Iran would have agreed via its normalization with Saudi Arabia, via China, that everything moves to regional stability. So Qatar, Iran was always the boogie monster because it was Qatar that was funding the Axis. And that was via channels, when you understand, that come from Western interests as well. So the whole terrorism boogie monster, we're going to be going through that and help you understand it with point blank evidence. But anyway, this is all needed for inbound investment. Now, of course, they'll push out Netanyahu rules the world, like he's on top of the power structure. But actually, he's just a bitch for the military industrial complex. And now the financial industrial complex is kicking in. And so they need to work out those finer details. At the same time, Turkey basically started mediating safe passage efforts. And so we started to see more and more movement towards that. Netanyahu is seeking US guarantees on security operations in Gaza. And so I don't think there'll be US boots on the ground, but he's seeking some kind of US guarantee as the narrative. But the GCC and the Gulf countries are likely to do that. But, the US can guarantee this type of thing. Maybe we'll see that. We'll see. Now, of course, because of these meetings, his trial was paused in order to focus on these important talks. And Trump came out and sent a letter out on social media that he sent it to the Israeli president, Herzog, and it was asking him to pardon Prime Minister Netanyahu. As part of Trump getting this deal through, the $2 billion via affinity partners, to make lots and lots of money out of the rebuild, Netanyahu would have used his leverage, and Netanyahu would have asked for Trump to do the pardon because he's already planned his exit, which may involve going to Hungary after the regime change. Maybe it involves going to Argentina, whatever it may be. But he's trying to make sure he's protecting his ass. There was also an announcement that Saudi Arabia will be hosting a US-Saudi investment summit that will be happening in Washington on November the 19th. So this is where Saudi will be buying all of the key assets of American corporations. So by partnering with the financial industrial complex, Saudi sovereign wealth fund gets to buy, which is reverse colonization. Whereas they were forced into IMF slavery before. You had the assassinations of King Faisal, replaced it with a member of the leadership that joined the Safari Club. that corrupted them into this is all covered in the documentary I want you to watch, so I won't go deeper into that. Please watch the documentary. It will be very enlightening. So the translation of an investment summit is essentially as follows: the BlackRock vision to reset the world order that was negotiated with the GCC. Basically, Trump will be selling off key US assets, mainly around artificial intelligence and obviously defense contracts as well. But this time it will be actually defense rather than the forever war. The forever war is the Israeli model. Now, this takes out the need for Israel in the middle. And so this is, the problem that most people are going to be seeing as well. So basically, they're using the kingdom's sovereign wealth. Now, where did they get that sovereign wealth? Well, originally it was the petrodollar. Now, I covered last week or a couple of weeks ago the petrodollar. When dollar is weakening, as we covered in the macro section, they have to sell gold or sell treasuries in order to protect their peg. They're not going to do that. So eventually the petrodollar is going to get weaker and weaker. They're doing more and more in the petro yuan, and they're doing it in multiple currencies via the China settlement networks. But it used to be that they made it through dollars. They sold off all their treasuries. They don't own that much anymore. And so who is their customer? So as they are buying US assets, reverse colonization, influence over the proof of weapons network and the financial industrial complex, their money is coming from China, because China is the number one customer for the oil from Qatar, from Saudi, from Russia, from Iran. That's why you're getting this normalization, because China wants them all to work together and build up. So that they have stable sources and purchase a product. America is a competition with the GCC because they're an energy exporter now. And so they are selling off their assets, which is the decolonization and reset of the world order that we're seeing. So the revenue that they're using to invest in America is via proxy from China. So China's buying up the assets via the sovereign wealth fund, which they will continue to subsidize. And we move to regional stability. So the end of the dollar as world reserve currency is good news, because the pound rolled over to the dollar. You had all of the death and destruction and violence, but now multipolarity is much, much better in terms of my future forecast. So it's never a doomerism. It's just the West needs to be sacrificed because they're owned by the proof of weapons network. So now that the US itself basically competes with Saudi, as we said, as an oil exporter, we're getting this new dynamic. And that's why I can say, however you've analyzed the American-Israel relationship and the Palestinian genocide and occupation in the past and ethnic cleansing, it changes now because of China. And so all of your previous analysis is all just narrative and rhetoric and propaganda based upon an old world empire. You need to get your mind out of US domination and into multipolarity, and that the only thing that propped up Israel was its subsidies as a colony of the American empire. So this marks a major shift in the petrodollar, as I've been covering for a long time. And so remember some of my predictions. I'll just lay them off again in case you're new to the show. I said the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, will control the region, regional stability, because they are the neighbor. They've got the sovereign wealth. Israel won't control, and Israel doesn't rule the world. Israel will eventually not be funded by American military industrial complex, which means it's no longer a destabilization state for the dollar. Iran has already normalized with the GCC, although it keeps its narrative. It's not funding the Axis. That's all being done via Qatar, and that's all stopped. So they're allowing these decapitation and integration regimes to happening. We still got what happens with Hamas, and I think we're going to see, that's already part of the ceasefire negotiation. But we still got Lebanon to resolve and Hezbollah, so there'll be still continual escalations there until there is a normalization process. And destabilization is no longer the goal, which changes everything. Israel has lost basically the reason to receive US military budgets now. And so it's no longer funded by Pentagon budgets. and the military industrial complex. So what do you need to do? You need to ratchet up the narrative that makes Zionism a toxic asset. In comes Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, Ian Carroll, Candace Owen. They de-radicalize the evangelical Christians and make Israel a toxic asset, where it's unpopular to take AIPAC money. Now, AIPAC is de-weaponized. They're no longer effective. The American billionaires no longer fund it because there's no return on investment. They never really cared too much about Zionism unless they could make money. So if the money and the return is not there, then you strategically weaken Israel. As you strategically weaken Israel, the stocks get pumped because they're run by the financial industrial complex, but the private equity goes into distress. GCC and the financial industrial complex buy one asset at a time, Israel as a toxic asset. There's no need for a war with Iran. If we do get an escalation, then it will be something like the 12-day war, which I always covered. I called it the 12-day theater when I was live on Spaces. Everybody was violently opposing me, getting angry at me. But I think that analysis was correct, because and the US is basically effectively handing over Israel to the GCC, Palestine as well, and they will be regional unification via their financial rails, via the defense contracts, via all the different types of models, and essentially it gets put back together. Mergers and acquisition is the game. I expect to see that more and more and more. So I want to remind you I'm going to play a little bit of an AI summary, because a while back, I think it was during the 12-day war, everyone was shouting at me because they were saying, see, Israel rules the world. Iran's going to go to war with America. We're going to enter into World War III. Israel and the Greater Israel Project, they're going to use nuclear weapons. And I was saying, no, the market's not reflecting that. And I was on those Spaces. I want to return because I created an analysis during the 12-day war, and we did a little AI summary. I'm going to play that AI summary whiteboard for you right now, just so you can remember, sorry. Maybe you weren't following me back then. I got a lot of new subscribers. So you can see what I was saying back then compared to where we are now. And this really helps. I'm building this foundation so that you can understand what we're doing. And I'm going to play a little AI whiteboard video on content I gave live, summarized from the live content during the 12-day war way back. I think it was earlier this year.
Part of his show, Bitcoin Hard Talk Episode 87, he looks at that whole recent flare-up between Iran, Israel, and the US, and argues it wasn't a war at all, but, well, something else entirely.
You know, it really wasn't that long ago that every single headline was screaming about World War III. It felt like we were right on the brink. But what if that wasn't the real story? What if what we were told was happening wasn't happening at all? This whole analysis really boils down to one massive question. Were we actually watching a war about to break out, or were we just watching a show?
And this quote from Simon Dixon himself just hits the nail on the head. I mean, think about that. The idea is that this whole 12-day event wasn't real. It was a performance, right? A pre-scripted play, a negotiation that was just disguised as a conflict. And it was all designed to hit a very specific goal that had nothing to do with fighting. So here's our game plan for breaking this all down. We're going to look at who's really pulling the strings. Then we'll walk through the 5 acts of this so-called conflict. After that, we'll get into the real goal, the financial reset. We'll even look at the insane opportunity cost in Bitcoin terms. And finally, we'll explore the new world order that Dixon says this whole thing created. All right, first up, the real power structure. Because look, to even begin to understand this idea of geopolitical theater, you have to know who the actors and the directors are. And according to this analysis, what most of us think is the power structure is completely wrong.
Okay, so this is what Dixon calls the biggest misconception out there. The common story, right, the one you hear all the time, is that Israel has this massive control over US foreign policy. But his analysis flips that completely on its head. He argues that Israel actually operates more like a colony of the United States, serving a, let's call it a deep state. And the reason for this setup? Plausible deniability. It lets the US get things done without officially having its fingerprints on it.
So if Israel is a colony, who does it serve? Well, according to Dixon, it's not the US government as we know it. It serves something he calls the proof of weapons network. Now, what the heck is that? It's basically a super powerful alliance. You've got the military-industrial complex, the financial-industrial complex, and big tech, all managed by these massive asset managers. Just imagine this giant shadowy boardroom of interest that actually profits from chaos and war. This network, he says, is the real power, not any single nation. Okay, so now that we have a sense of who's supposedly in charge, let's look at how this all played out on the world stage. We're getting into the 5-act conflict, because the argument here is that this wasn't random, it wasn't chaotic. It was a performance, a play, with 5 very clear, scripted acts. So here's the play-by-play according to the script. Act 1, Israel bombs a target. The goal? Not to start a war, but to take out some Iranian hardliners who were against a secret deal. Act 2, Iran retaliates, but again, not to escalate. The goal was to strategically weaken certain Israeli assets so they could be taken over by corporations later. Weird, right? Act 3, the US swoops in and says, we stopped it, a theatrical bombing of a threat that was never really there. Act 4, Iran launches another retaliation, but they give everyone a heads up first, so it does no real damage, it's just to save face. And that leads to the finale, Act 5, a 3-way victory lap. Israel, Iran, and the US all go home and tell their people they won.
Okay, so you're probably thinking, why? Why go through all this trouble? If it wasn't a real war, what was the whole point of this elaborate show? Well, as they always say, you gotta follow the money. And that brings us to the financial reset goal. The argument is the real motive here was never about bombs and borders. It was always about the balance sheet.
And here it is, the main objective, the big why behind the whole performance. A global financial reset. That's it. The whole spectacle, all the headlines, all the fear. It was all cover for a massive pivot. A plan to shift the entire world from one economic model to a completely new one.
So who are the big players in this supposed reset? Well, it's not just countries. The theory is that you have these massive financial giants, think BlackRock, working behind the scenes, and they're coordinating with the Gulf states, the GCC, and the BRICS nations. The idea is that these countries were using this moment as leverage to finally get out from under the thumb of US military influence.
And this slide just lays out the whole economic shift perfectly. You have the old model, profiting from forever wars in the Middle East, constant conflict, constant spending. And then you have the new model, the one this whole theater was supposedly designed to create, profiting from rebuilding and investing in that exact same region. It's a shift from breaking things to fixing things, for a profit, of course.
But here's the thing. Pulling off a show like this, it's not cheap, not by a long shot. The price tag for this performance was absolutely astronomical. So let's talk about that cost. Dixon calculated it in a really interesting way, a way that really drives home just how much value was just gone.
Get ready for this number. The opportunity cost over just 12 days of this show was a staggering 240,837 Bitcoin. Let me say that again. Over 240,000 Bitcoin. That's the equivalent of $25.5 billion at the time. Just poof, vaporized.
And if that number doesn't sound huge, let's put it in perspective. That is more than 1% of all the Bitcoin that will ever exist. Ever. Gone, wasted in less than 2 weeks on what this analysis calls a completely fake, scripted conflict. It's just mind-boggling when you think about it like that.
And this is where it really comes back to the core ideas of this analysis. It draws a huge contrast between two systems. On one side, you have the violent proof of weapons network. How does it pay for all this destruction? By printing fiat currency out of thin air, which devalues your money through inflation. You and I pay the price. On the other side, you have Bitcoin's peaceful proof of work system, which is all about incentivizing creation and building security, not destroying things. Okay, so let's recap. We've got a staged war, a massive financial reset, and an almost unbelievable cost. So, what was the end game? What did all this achieve? That brings us to the final piece, the New World Order that this performance supposedly ushered in.
Now hold on, because this next part is a really counterintuitive take, especially given the common narratives. The analysis presents Donald Trump not as some kind of outsider fighting the system, but as a key agent of that same financial industrial complex. The idea is that his policies, his tariffs, his deals, they weren't random. They were the first crucial steps needed to set the stage and kick off this whole global reset.
So this timeline really ties it all together. In the past, we had the forever wars era. That was the old money-making model. In the future, we have the financial rebuilding era, the new model. So what about the present? Well, that's where this geopolitical theater comes in. It was the bridge, the performance, designed to get us from the old world to the new one.
And so, what's the final result of all this, according to the theory? A definitive move toward a multipolar world. The GCC and the BRICS nations basically decolonize from US military influence, taking back regional control. And what fills that vacuum? Not another army, but the Western financial complex, which now gets to come in and profit from this brand new era of rebuilding and investment. Which brings us to the final, really provocative question that this whole analysis leaves you with. A question that kind of gets to the heart of everything. When we're watching the news, when we see these world events unfold, are we actually seeing a real conflict? Or are we just watching the public performance of a massive behind-the-scenes financial deal being hammered out? Is all of geopolitics just a stage?
I hope you enjoyed that. Now, I want to be clear. It's not that this death and destruction isn't real. It is real. But the Proof of Weapons Network doesn't care. It has no connection to humanity. All right. So, yeah, just to be clear, I'm not saying that this war didn't actually happen and the deaths didn't happen. They happened. But this is how the Proof of Weapons Network works. And you can see the difference between a real war and a fake war. Iraq was a real war. This was a theater in order to move to the next phase. And if you would like to go to my blog, simondixon.com, on the blog, you can type in play-by-play. And if you'd like more details, just to really understand how these things work, I give like a full breakdown in text in the actual live an hour and a half that I actually did during the actual war. So we can analyze whether these things are actually happening or not. So anyway, I just wanted to play that video and you can check out the war. So what else did we see happen this week in geopolitics? Well, we had a statement from Syria, which is after meeting, the president of Syria met with Donald Trump, and basically saying that Syria can't push away Russia for America because they have to do trade. And so this kind of lets you know that this isn't American domination. This is BRICS and America as a regional power. And so this is sitting in the middle of these different relationships. And this is what you're going to see more and more and more of. And so they made a public statement about their need, to work with Russia. And Russia has interests in Syria, as well as US, which currently occupies through the Kurds the oil. But we also had an interesting announcement. So you had the White House visit, which we're going to go through in a bit. And I'm just going to play a quick clip of some of the interviews on Fox TV so we can understand that. But Syria basically officially also announced after this that they're joining a US-led international coalition against ISIS. And so they have become the 90th member against ISIS. Just to get this straight, you've got the person that was the head of Al-Qaeda that turned into ISIS joining a coalition against ISIS when ISIS and Al-Qaeda were creations of America via Israel with plausible deniability. And this is why Julian Assange really was attacked by the Proof of Weapons Network, because he had to get the financial industrial complex took down WikiLeaks when he was exposing all this stuff during the Iraqi war and what came later. And so they took him out, and the only reason he survived was because he could fund his website with Bitcoin. And so, ISIS is a US and Israel creation of the military industrial complex. And I'm going to show you with irrefutable proof, and we're going to play a bit of an AI summary here because I want you to get it. But for those that would watch the documentary that I shared, the 4-hour documentary, I'll show you how they were created with irrefutable proof and who was actually involved in 9/11 as per declassified documents and categoric irrefutable proof that the story you were told is not the real story. And we're going to be using the work of Ryan Dawson, who did an incredible documentary on that. Anyway, this is a movement towards a US exit of the forever war military model, a replacement with the financial industrial complex that owns America and owns Israel and owns UK and Europe, negotiating with the Gulf countries that is powered by BRICS, headed by China. And that's the power structure that has changed the petrodollar forever. Now, there was an article in Axios, which historically, whenever you see something in Axios, that doesn't mean it's true. It means that's what Israel wants you to think. So it's an Israeli propaganda piece. Whenever they want you to think something like that they control the world or they own MBS or whatever, Axios will print it. And then that means in general, what I've observed, that's what Israel wants you to think, so they can fake it till they make it and try and project strength and make it true. So Netanyahu basically denied the claim that they are negotiating a new 20-year support with US. Now think about that. This would be the first time Israel is not supported by the US in terms of financial budget. And Axios leaks an article, which is Israeli propaganda, saying that they're negotiating a 20-year deal. And then Netanyahu comes out, and we know that they're paying $7,000 per social media post to perpetuate Zionist propaganda. He comes out and says, no, we're not negotiating the 20-year deal. We need to be independent. Netanyahu privatized all the nationalized assets of Israel, which then slowly got it sold off, which will also be, and then move the economy into distress through the October the 7th operation, which we've covered in the past, the blog Atrocity Inc. on my blog. You can find out how everything was a lie there as well. But he's claiming now that Israel wants to be independent. Now we know that an independent Israel is not a sustainable economy, particularly after their debt to GDP is going through the roof. Their ports have been closed, and everything that happened during the 12-day war, where Iran took out the key assets that financially distressed, which was agreed to, in my opinion, by Israel in exchange for Iran agreeing to take out the IRGC hardliners that would never have agreed to the regional stability plan. Then remember, in Iran, you had the helicopter come down. I think that was an inside job. And then you had the new Reform Party in Iran. And then America came in and said, we took out the nuclear program. Then you had Iran targeted Qatar, which ended it. And then Israel then targeted Qatar in the next phase. And we covered all the live implications of saying that was fake, known in advance. And that was to move it to the lasting ceasefire. And then eventually the overthrow of the Israeli cabinet, the overthrow of Hamas with a Palestinian authority that will be both GCC puppets and the distressed acquisition and the regional stability plan. And then Trump came out and released the 20-point plan that we've also covered as well. So was there anything this week that backs up whether that's actually happening? Well, there was an announcement that one of the members of the GCC, the United Arab Emirates, is acquiring, may end up acquiring Israeli assets. So the UAE-based world company called DP World, which took basically full control over Syria's Tartus port, which was previously promised under the Assad regime to Russia. And now UAE has come in and it came in with an $800 million investment into the deal. So this looks like Russia was okay with the deal. China was okay with the deal. Iran was okay with the deal. The GCC is okay with the deal. And now we're seeing that the GCC is acquiring parts of Syria. For regional stability, you'll have Syria, you'll have Lebanon, you'll have Israel, and you'll have Palestine that all need regime change into GCC-aligned leadership. Now, who's in charge of that port within Syria? Well, Fahad al-Bana was named the CEO of DP World in Tartus. And so this, I believe, is kind of showing that when we follow the money and move towards these deals, we can see where this is going. Israel doesn't rule the world. Israel is a colony in the military-industrial complex. And because China normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia, we're getting GCC investing in regional stability supported by Western banking financial interests as well. Now, remember what I covered last week and the week before about Sudan? I was saying there is genuinely humanitarian crisis. It's awful. But the North Africa region, I believe that there was a big push to weaken USE by the Proof of Weapons Network in order to draw that one to a close, not on UAE's terms, but on the terms of the Proof of Weapons Network. And so because they're involved in crimes against humanity, that on that side in Sudan, they're now drawing attention to it when this has been going on for a long, long time, and they never got the media attention. And so the sudden uptick in coverage on RSF, which is the militia group that is committing the crimes against humanity, that was did a coup internally, and they control vast amounts of the oil mining, the gold mining fields. I believe that this is designed to draw this to a close. The Proof of Weapons Network has orchestrated all the media push, and this means that basically they're pushing UAE to end the RSF so that we can move towards regional stability in the African regions. And what did we get as an announcement? So Marco Rubio from the Trump administration, he made a public statement on Sudan. And again, you don't listen to what they say, you listen to what's happening and recognize that this is what they want you to believe. So quote, Marco Rubio, the RSF don't have manufacturing capabilities. Someone is giving them the money and someone's giving them the weapons. And it's coming through some country. So they don't want to name the UAE. We know who they are, and we're going to talk to them so they have a relationship about it, and make them understand it's going to reflect poorly on them. So this is what I think more evidence towards that this is hopefully the crimes against humanity are going to be coming towards an end. There's going to be pressure applied. But as I said previously, if the Proof of Weapons Network is applying the media blitz, it means they're trying to strategically weaken UAE's brand, and that's to weaken the GCC. And the UAE is the only one that's going to be able to make Israeli purchase of those assets because of their normalization and Abraham Accords. And so this is to try and get the deal more on the Proof of Weapons Network and the financial industrial complex's terms. And so while I am happy that this is getting the attention that it needs, it also means that there's going to be more leverage for the Proof of Weapons Network. Anyway, the moral of the story, I'm hoping that hopefully Sudan is going to come to an end. We'll get some kind of end towards this, but I feel like it's being leveraged in the regional stability plan in the Middle East, and they're using North Africa in order to try and strategically weaken these negotiations. Now, at the same time this week, what did we get yesterday and over the last few days? We got more Epstein email leaks. How do we interpret that? So most people believe that Israel controls the Epstein because it was done via, connected. Jeffrey Epstein was connected to both Mossad and the CIA as blackmail operations. But Mossad, we know that that's US military industrial complex. And Jeffrey Epstein tend to be in with the tech class and the finance class. So that's the banksters. So you had the financial industrial complex, the technical industrial complex, blackmail operations, as well as the military industrial complex that way. So I personally believe that Trump can't release the files. Israel can't release the files because who's on the files? Well, we know that the banker of Jeffrey Epstein was JP Morgan, and this uncovers the black op, sex trafficking, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, and drug trafficking rings of the CIA and Mossad, which is how they fund these black op operations. So whoever controls the Epstein files is leaking the files And I believe that they are on the side of this multipolar world order. So maybe there are factions of the military-industrial complex, this is one way to interpret it, that is still getting patriotic and nationalistic about American dominance. And maybe that is some financier on that network that's not playing ball, and they're sending a signal out there. We know what we got on you. And so we'll leak parts of the emails to remind everybody that we're moving to a multipolar world order. And so basically to remind them that even though you may be a Zionist, you're acting against Israel right now. It's not for Israel, because let's weaken some of the military industrial complex power and push it back to the financial industrial complex. I believe the financial, one of those JP Morgans or whoever, faction of power and covert operations controls the Epstein files, and they will never release it because they're implicated, but they can release the bits that they have on other people. So I think, the financial industrial complex is expecting destabilization campaigns in the West, the West decline, utilization of the dollar, Trump, make sure that you're not America first, you're proof of weapons network first, and financial industrial complex first. Keep everybody in line, making sure that they're moving to this, executing what is expected of them. And of course, pushing the narrative that this is Israel and Israel blackmails, so that when America wants this divorce, it can say, we didn't do any of this genocide. It was simply because Jeffrey Epstein blackmailed us, and we're the ethical people. We defend democracy. We're the beacon of hope and the land of the free in the West. And basically, this is an orderly pivot of capital, making sure that all the capital is going towards outflows, towards the GCC, towards BRICS, towards the Asian connected regions. And so we got that big correction in the stock market and that big correction in Bitcoin and various other things. Now, what happened? Why did we get the head of Al-Qaeda at the White House? Well, it's because the next goal is that there's going to be all the front running, I believe, deals of making Syria look like, oh, they're killing the Christians. Remember, we covered the killing the Christian narrative. They're killing everyone, but that's the hardliners in the regional stability. And then they push out the media and pretend it's the Muslims killing the Christians, because they can utilize that in the West for the Muslim hatred. And then they also want the Jew hatred. Epstein's blackmailing us. It's those pesky Jews that rule the world. All of that is to, in the West, create the destabilization campaign. But at the same time, you can use those narratives to make it look like Syria is in carnage. Syria is uninvestable. Syria is on the verge of going back to the civil war. It only goes back if the proof of weapons network wants it, and that means the deal's being reversed and the military takes over. That's not happening. This is all moving. And so what I think is happening here is they're trying to get all of the deals at bargain prices because the GCC wants to control Syria. The head of Al-Qaeda, Gilani, he is mainly an in-between Turkey and the GCC, the two factions of power. And so therefore, he's negotiating with the financial industrial complex, just like with UAE. And the weaker you can make Israel, the weaker you can make Syria look, the better you can lock in those preferential deals. So I think the Syrian president went to the White House, which is Trump, via the command of the financial industrial complex, was given the legitimacy. So he was there to give the Syrian president, the ex-Al-Qaeda, ex-ISIS, legitimacy. And in order to give that legitimacy so they can move towards this, they put him on Fox News and did an interview as well. Trump basically legitimized the ex-ISIS leader by allowing them to go to the White House. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do two more things. This all happened. I said, I think this is moving towards it. I'm going to play an interview from Fox News where the ex-head of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, now the president of Syria, was on Fox News. And then I want you to understand why this can happen and why Israel is freaking out via their Laura Loomers and various others, because they're being forced down the network to give more power to the military in these negotiations. So let's have a quick listen to the president of Syria on Fox News to give a signal to Americans that we're legitimizing the president of Syria. And then I'm going to make you and help you understand how this can possibly happen. And we're going to go into the final AI summary after that goes through 9/11, Al-Qaeda, right up to this meeting in White House, and point you to where you can watch the full blog, which I'd love for you to do. Watch the full documentary by Ryan Dawson. And then you'll never be fooled by this stuff ever again. Once you know, you can't unsee it, how the military works. Okay, so let's look at the second video, and hopefully I won't mess up my sound this time. This is the president of Syria, the ex-head of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, on Fox News after a haircut and a suit, wearing a suit.
A Syrian president visits the White House since the establishment of Syria in the 40s of the last century. And so after the fall of the former regime, Syria has entered into a new era, and this will build on a new strategy with the United States, especially with the United States.
Did you commit to having the country join the coalition to fight ISIS in the Middle East?
We participated in so many battles against Daesh, against ISIS for 10 years, and we have suffered a lot during these battles, and I have lost much of my forces in the battles against ISIS. There are reasons for the presence of the United States militarily in Syria. It needs to be with the coordination with the Syrian government right now. So we need to discuss these matters, and we need to talk about and get into an agreement about ISIS.
You were affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Just 11 months ago, you were designated by the U.S. government a foreign terrorist. You were actually on the wanted list. Times have obviously changed. Now you're playing basketball with military leaders here in Washington. You're meeting with President Trump. What has changed in the U.S.-Syria relationship? And then equally importantly, sir, what has changed about you in that time?
We talked about the future, the present, and the past, and so we talked about lifting the sanctions, and there was a decision at the United Nations, at the Security Council, to lift the sanctions on myself and other people as well.
Has President Trump raised with you, discussed with you, your own past affiliation with Al-Qaeda terrorism?
I think this is a matter of the past now. We did not discuss this actively. We talked about the president and the future. We talked about the investment opportunities in the future in Syria, and so that Syria is no longer looked at as a security threat. It is now looked at as a geopolitical ally, and it's a place where the United States can have great investments, especially extracting gas.
Do you, Mr. President, have regrets that Al-Qaeda carried out those attacks that killed 3,000 Americans?
I was only 19 years old, so I was a very young person, and it didn't have any decision-making power at that time, and I don't have anything to do with it. And Al-Qaeda was not present right then in my area. So you're speaking to the wrong person about this subject. We mourn for every civilian that got killed, and we know that people suffer from the war, especially civilians who paid a hefty price for the war.
Mr. President, the White House has said that President Trump would like Syria to join the Abraham Accords. The foundational principle of the Accords is that Israel has the right to exist as a sovereign Jewish state. Is that something that you agree with?
I believe that this situation in Syria is different from this situation of the countries who went on with the Abrahamic agreement. Syria has borders with Israel, and Israel occupies the Golan Heights since 1967. We are not going to enter into a negotiation directly right now. Maybe the United States administration with the President Trump will help us reach this kind of negotiation.
We understand that your predecessor, Bashar al-Assad, is living well in Moscow. He's, as far as we know, he is not.
Okay, I think that's enough. I just want people to understand the. All right, so I just want to help you understand the sheer theater of how politics works in America and the proof of weapons network. So firstly, Jelani meets Trump. What does that actually mean? That means that because Trump is an agent of the financial industrial complex faction of the proof of weapons network, this is about sealing deals and legitimizing Jelani by having the photo op with Trump. So that would have been a series of negotiations from the financial industrial complex. Now he goes on Fox News, and Fox News is maybe affiliated with the Mossad, the military industrial complex factions of power. And so in order to put him through a humiliation ritual, you bring up 9/11, you bring up operations, you bring up connections with Assad, you bring up connections with Russia, so that you can weaken that position, because Syria is currently occupied in part. I went to Jordan, and the Golan Heights, you can see from Jordan, are occupied by Israel at the moment. And so this is, you know, a ritual to try and maybe give some more negotiation power to the other factions of the military industrial complex. So you can see the internal struggle, whereas Jelani is representing Turkey's interest and a go-between between the GCC power struggle between the GCC, Saudi, and Turkey. So the media is just an outlet for the financial weapons of mass destruction as we move and know that Syria is going to be one of the most profitable investments. Now, Trump doesn't remove full sanctions, because the removal of full sanctions, he needs to get all his buddies in, affinity partners, Jared Kushner Fund, all the different banksters that have been going to be given the best deals to invest in regional stability. So after this interview, what did Trump announce? Trump announced that US business executives are going to be having a private meeting in the White House. And this was right after the Syria meeting. Who was in the meeting? The New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, JP Morgan, BlackRock, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs. And my guess is that they were discussing the investments in Syria in order to engage in the rebuild before the sanctions gets lifted. So remember, sanctions are a financial weapon of mass destruction, not to engage in peace, not because you care about Christian massacres, because you funded ISIS, and we're going to prove that today. You created and killed those, you know, through the propping up the dollar of the proof of weapons network. And so please understand, when Trump's talking about Christians in Nigeria, I hope you can use this to be symbolic and understand. Now, let's remember, Al-Qaeda were so-called involved in 9/11 to kill 3,000 Americans, which was a CIA op that involved Mossad factions of intelligence, Saudi factions of intelligence, as we're going to share and show you irrefutably. No doubt whatsoever. Not conspiracy theory, conspiracy fact. And so there will be sanctions relief after the GCC and the financial industrial complex get the deals first. And this is why Israel influencers and the media were freaking out and saying Israel's going to be independent. We don't need US budgets anymore. It's time for us to go independent. You had all the Laura Loomers and the influencers that are on there, probably $7,000 per tweet from Israel propaganda. They were all freaking out. And what were they all doing? They were highlighting that we've got Al-Qaeda boss and we got president of Syria, and Trump is doing deals with the quote unquote terrorists. Now, let me help you unpack this and show it's really simple. Those who orchestrated 9/11, those that benefited from a widespread marketing campaign of terrorism are the exact same group that are now benefiting from embracing the quote unquote terrorists now, because they created them. This was the banks and financial institutions all along to prop up the dollar. And they create that religious tension, and they weaponize religions to fool the Jews into ethnically cleansing the Palestinians by going to Israel and believing that you need to worship Israel via the evangelical Christians in America, and creating the fake war on terror by killing Americans to radicalize Christians into going to war with Iraq, Sudan, Syria, and then funding the very same militia groups in order to destabilize the region and gain access to the resources and fund their black op operations so they can create more crimes against humanity, to get access to the rare earth minerals, to bring them back home, prop up the dollar, steal the money from the American people by creating inflation and pushing it back up to the corporate stocks, and using fiscal dominance to bankrupt the US government for the benefit of the financial industrial complex. If you understand this, then you completely should be able to understand that there's no such thing as terrorist, that Islamist terrorist was a theater Hollywood creation by the Proof of Weapons Network. Now you got to ask yourself, how do you make sense of what's happening in the world today? When you have been lied to so badly, are you going to continue to be a useful idiot for the military industrial complex by falling for their racial hate, their religious hate, their open borders, closed border operations? Because what's going to happen? What came after 9/11, the Patriot Act? What came after the border crisis? Palantir. Where was Palantir tested? In Gaza, in the West Bank, in Ukraine, in UK, in Europe, in Saudi. Now you get it? Now do you get it? The word terrorist is a blank term with no definition, so they can take away your human rights and they can call you terrorist when they need to use it against you. Just as all of these different operations are designed to scare the hell out of you, and they don't care about your life. That's why Jelani can go from chopping heads and having videos of him chopping heads to becoming the man that essentially will unify Syria and then he can conduct meetings with Trump on Veterans Day. On Veterans Day. This quote unquote same organization that somehow managed to pull off taking down the Twin Towers. So basically, the groups that you were radicalized into believing were terrorists are nothing but paid mercenaries. And everything was created in order to radicalize you, to justify stealing money from you, exporting inflation globally, using the IMF and the World Bank in order to fund wars. And that was the purpose of the whole thing. And people are still falling it for now. And they're using the very same tactics that we used to destabilize the Middle East, destabilize Asia, destabilize the global South, destabilize Africa. They're using them on you now. The objective and the missions, they're all passed down by the same people, the same geopolitical agencies. And in the case of America, the funded militia are not even for they're not even for the country's interest. They're for corporate interest. The same companies that are stealing all of those dollars, that own the Federal Reserve and the private banking sector and the financial industrial complex, and they don't care about anything, and they're willing to engage in crimes against humanity so that they can blame someone else. So with this, what I'd like to do is help you understand that, in fact, what was 9/11? Nothing to do with people being jealous of your freedom. It was actually a hugely profitable operation for the US proof of weapons network and the private sector and the very stocks that you're buying. The ones that I encourage people to boycott the Fed by owning Bitcoin, boycott BlackRock and the financial industrial complex by owning it in self-custody rather than an ETF, boycott the banks by not borrowing against it and mining some fiat currency with your Bitcoin so that they can use it as a weapon, and spend local so that you can look after yourself, your family, and your community, and the local businesses around you. And hopefully, if it continues to do what it did in the past, you can outperform the proof of weapons network and be wealthy enough to control politics, control their share prices, and make a change using the very same financial weapons of mass destruction, but this time for sovereign and for force. And it's the only way we're going to do it. They're powerful. That's why they want your Bitcoin. That's why they're co-opting Bitcoin right now. So Giuliani, being their president of Syria, is a hugely profitable operation for the same proof of weapons network. It's just different departments. Before it was the military industrial complex, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, Raytheon, Boeing, and now Palantir. And now it is JP Morgan, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, Bank of America, and all of the Goldman Sachs and all of the financial terrorists that Trump had to meet right after the meeting with Giuliani. The proof of weapons network is what backs the dollar. And what I'd love for you to do is after this, over the weekend, read the blog in full. I'm going to play an AI summary to close out right now of the 4-hour documentary from Ryan Dawson combined with my 17 minutes intro. If you really want to understand how the world works, if you really want to understand how we fight back with our own peaceful, how we do this, you're living through one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Most are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do really well. I want you to be on the right side of the change so that we can do it with peace, love, and unity. And understand the importance. The vote is not the vote. The politicians are corrupt to the core. The government's not going to save you. Trump's not going to save you. He's not the Messiah. There is no plan. You don't need to trust it. That was a psyop. That was an intelligence operation as well from the same people that did 9/11 and the same people that are negotiating how to profit from regional stability. And that's the only reason why we're going to actually have a liberated Palestine right now and a Palestinian state. Because the Saudis bought Europe, the Qataris bought Europe, and they had to bribe Trump through a $2 billion fund via Jared Kushner in order to invest in regional stability. And they created, through the petrodollar, enough sovereign wealth to negotiate with the financial industrial complex. And rather than being a useful idiot for divide and conquer between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Iran and Israel via this state that was created to destabilize the region, China came along and said, let's de-dollarize. Let's normalize between Iran and Saudi Arabia because I'm going to buy your oil as long as we reset the world order and you do the negotiation with the financial industrial complex and you can sit in the middle of the world, and rather than killing each other, we can build. And America can be regional and the military can make up for lost profits by essentially undoing what Europe and America benefited from by them going back and doing it on their own people. And that's what the Ukraine war and the Russia war is about. So the blog that I posted was called, please go over to my blog, simondixon.com, From 9/11 to the White House, when the ex-Al-Qaeda boss becomes Syria's president and has dinner with Donald Trump. And I want to thank Ryan Dawson for the work that he did. You may not agree with his other political opinions, but appreciate the work. And on this blog, 4 hours of irrefutable evidence so that you can understand who the real enemy is and you don't become a useful idiot, and you can boycott the system and you can use your financial vote because it's your money that matters, because that's the only people that get to actually have an influence in this new structure. They want you pointing at Mondani. They want you pointing at Trump. They're just the front people to take the blame, to get rich, so that you're not pointing at the real power structure, which is the proof of weapons network. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to play the longer AI summary. Enjoy it. If you watch nothing else, just watch this one. But I'd encourage you to watch the full blog with all the papers, all the evidence, all the declassified documents, all the leaks, all the names, everything around who did 9/11 and how that relates to what's happening today. Now, the conclusion that Ryan comes to is there will be war with Iran because he's from that belief that Israel rules the world. I personally believe, for all the reasons that I presented today, that there won't be a war with Iran. And if there is, it will be something like the 12-day theater in order to get to the next stage of regional stability. So with that in mind, that's going to be everything for Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 106, other than the AI summary. But I'll leave you with that longer AI summary of the 4-hour documentary. And I will see you this time next week for Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 107. Peace. And I'm going to play the documentary now, and hopefully the sound works and I won't have...
Welcome to the deep dive. So our mission, as always, is to take some really challenging source material, often stuff sent in by you, the listener, and really try to break down the hidden architecture of power within it.
Yeah, and today's material is definitely ambitious. It's dense, it's provocative. We're looking at an analysis connecting 9/11, decades of conflict, right up to today's geopolitics.
And we're focusing specifically on the work of Simon Dixon. The source material identifies him as, let's see, a Bitcoin OG, an investor, and a geopolitical and financial analyst.
That's right. And Dixon's analysis, it really distills insights from a very comprehensive source, a 4-hour documentary by Ryan Dawson called Empire Unmasked Redux. And that was published October 6, 2025, according to the notes. Okay, so Dixon is analyzing Dawson's work, and the whole thing kicks off with this really arresting headline from Dixon's blog, right on his website. It's titled, From 9/11 to the White House, when the ex-Al-Qaeda boss becomes Syria's president and dines with Trump. I mean, that alone just stops you in your tracks. It really does. It's basically the thesis statement for this whole discussion.
Yeah.
Because it focuses on Abu Muhammad al-Julani. Now, this is someone who's, the former head of ISIS in Syria. Now he leads HTS, a powerful group backed by Turkey and the Gulf states.
And didn't he have, like, a massive bounty on his head?
A huge one. $10 million from the U.S. government. And yet the source material we're looking at alleges this same guy, Julani, was recently seen effectively negotiating in Washington, maybe even being positioned as potentially the next leader of Syria.
Wow. Okay, that's the contradiction right there.
Mm-hmm.
How does someone go from being enemy number one, $10 million bounty, to shaking hands in D.C.?
Exactly. And Dixon's argument is you can only understand that apparent contradiction if you look past the official story, the public narrative, and see the hidden framework operating behind the scenes. He calls it the proof of weapons network.
The proof of weapons network. Okay.
So our goal today is really to try and map that network out.
Mm-hmm.
Dixon calls the official narrative, the story we're all told, a fairy tale.
A fairy tale.
Yeah, one specifically crafted, he argues, to justify, 2 decades of nonstop war, the erosion of civil liberties, and the creation of this massive global surveillance apparatus we all live under now.
So the idea is to kind of push aside the flags and the rhetoric and just look at the plumbing, the mechanics of how it works?
Precisely. We need to focus on the financial flows, the logistics, the mechanics of power, not the ideologies used to sell it all.
All right, let's start right there then, defining these mechanics. What exactly is the proof of weapons network, according to this analysis?
So Dixon's core idea, his thesis, is that the story we get fed, the one that demands unquestioning patriotism, It's just operational cover. It's not the real reason things happen.
Okay, so what is the real reason, according to him?
The proof of weapons network. He describes it as the actual infrastructure. It's used by, let's say, deeply embedded elements within intelligence agencies, state actors, to deliberately manufacture crises, conflicts, pretext for war.
Manufacture them, like create them out of thin air, or, steer events, exploit existing tensions, fund certain groups, all with one primary goal: generating massive guaranteed profits for the military-industrial complex, the MIC. Okay, so forget spreading democracy or fighting evil empires. The argument is these wars are basically giant, elaborate logistics operations designed purely to move money.
That's the raw assertion, yes.
If that's the case, how does that money actually move? We're talking trillions over the years. How is that laundered or managed?
Well, the source describes it as a kind of financial engineering system. It's designed for maximum profit, yes, but also, crucially, for maximum plausible deniability. Nobody wants their fingerprints directly on this stuff.
Right, so how does it start with the official budgets?
It starts there.
Yeah.
You've got the huge official Pentagon budgets, trillions allocated every year. But for the really dirty stuff, the illegal ops, the black operations that Congress can't know about or approve, that money needs to be washed.
Yep.
The source material points to routing these funds through friendly jurisdictions, places where the rules are different, where oversight is, let's say, minimal. Israel is cited specifically as a primary hub, a place where illegal actions can happen off balance sheet.
Off balance sheet. That's the key, isn't it? It means the U.S. government can fund something, make it happen, but legally pretend it has nothing to do with them. No accountability.
Exactly. Plausible deniability baked right into the financial structure. But the money can't just disappear offshore. It needs to come back, right, to feed the beast.
So how does it loop back into the U.S. system? Defense contracts. That laundered off-balance sheet money flows back into the U.S., specifically into the stock market, through massive, often no-bid contracts awarded to the giants of the MIC. You know the names: Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Raytheon, Boeing, and newer players too, right? The source mentioned Palantir.
Yes. Crucially, companies like Palantir, which specialize in the surveillance and data side of modern warfare. This massive influx of capital flowing back from these hidden operations artificially inflates the stock prices of these specific companies,
creating a kind of guaranteed return for those invested in the MIC.
Absolutely. It becomes a huge financial boon. It helps stabilize the dollar. It shores up the MIC itself. It's described as a self-perpetuating profit loop, fueled entirely by generating and managing perpetual conflict.
But this network, it needs actual boots on the ground, right? Or at least proxy forces. And you can't pay them out of the official traceable defense budget.
No, you definitely can't. And that's where the really dark funding sources allegedly come in, the truly illicit stuff.
What kind of stuff are we talking about?
According to the sources, the money to pay these privateers, these rented militias, these deniable assets, it comes from organized crime, specifically things like sex trafficking, human trafficking, and very significantly, large-scale international drug trafficking.
Wow. So intelligence agencies getting into bed with organized crime to fund black ops.
The sources point to historical precedents. They mention Operation Gladio.
Yeah.
The NATO stay-behind armies in Europe after World War II, which got linked to various illicit activities. And they talk extensively about the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI.
BCCI. That was huge in the 80s and early 90s.
Massive. And according to this analysis, it wasn't just a corrupt bank. It was the primary global money laundering backbone for the whole system, used by the CIA, used to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, even used by the early elements of Al-Qaeda, allegedly. Its structure was perfect for hiding these global flows of illicit cash. It's a really grim picture. Kind of parasitic relationship. Organized crime generates dirty money. Intelligence agencies launder it to pay proxies. The proxies create chaos, and that chaos justifies the massive, clean defense contracts that profit the MIC. That's the cycle described in the source material, yes. It's brutal, but according to Dixon, highly effective financially. But okay, money and logistics aside, how do you get people to actually do the fighting and killing? How do you motivate these groups? You can't just put an ad in the paper, warlords wanted. No, you need ideology. And this is where the network allegedly gets incredibly cynical. It weaponizes religion with surgical precision. They find, fund, and empower specific, often fringe, ideological groups. In the Middle East context, the sources point specifically to certain Salafi or Wahhabi interpretations of Islam, the kind associated with groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They provide the money, the weapons, the training.
And then unleash them.
And then, critically, they record their actions, especially the most brutal parts. When these proxies commit violence, maybe shouting religious phrases like Allah Akbar before an attack, intelligence services are allegedly right there capturing it.
Why? What's the purpose of recording that?
To maximize the shock value back home in the West. That footage, those recordings, are then carefully disseminated. The goal is to horrify Western populations, to radicalize us against this perceived existential Islamic threat.
Which then justifies
limitless security budgets, more surveillance, more war. But it's a two-way street. This manufactured enemy isn't just used to scare Westerners. It's also used to mobilize other groups.
What do you mean?
The sources argue this network weaponizes Judaism, using the manufactured threat to justify Israeli military actions and rally support for the IDF. And it weaponizes Christianity, particularly tapping into evangelical Christian beliefs in the U.S. to build a powerful political and financial base that supports perpetual conflict in the Middle East against this constructed religious enemy.
So it's like playing different ideologies off against each other, all to serve this underlying financial and geopolitical machine.
That's the core claim. The conflict itself, the sources insist, is largely synthetic. It's an elaborate, bloody stage play designed for profit and control.
Okay, if this network is constantly manufacturing pretexts, always looking for the next crisis to exploit, then the biggest one, the event that changed everything, 9/11, the idea that it was just a random bolt from the blue attack because they hate our freedoms, that has to be the cornerstone of the deception, doesn't it?
Absolutely. According to this analysis, if the public ever truly believed that 9/11 wasn't a surprise, that the subsequent wars were part of a pre-existing plan, well, the whole justification collapses. Consent vanishes overnight. Let's move into that. Section 2. The idea that this wasn't a reaction, but a pre-planned imperial escapade. Yeah, the fabrication of surprise is absolutely essential. That narrative, America attacked out of the blue, they hate us for our freedom. The sources claim this was deliberately constructed. It was the necessary emotional and political leverage to launch what they call a multi-trillion-dollar imperial campaign.
And the evidence for this premeditation, a lot of it seems to circle back to General Wesley Clark, doesn't it? The former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. His accounts from inside the Pentagon right after 9/11 are just stunning.
They really are. Clark provides what many see as the smoking gun for premeditation. He talks about being at the Pentagon around, say, September 20th, 2001, just days after the attacks. And the decision to invade Iraq was already made, locked in. Despite, and this is crucial, absolutely zero new evidence linking Saddam Hussein to al-Qaeda or specifically to the 9/11 attacks.
So the justification we heard later, Saddam, al-Qaeda, WMDs, it was all backfilled. The decision came first.
That's what Clark's account implies. He even recalls asking a senior military official why they were going after Iraq, and the official basically just shrugged and said, I don't know, or maybe we don't know. Meaning the why didn't matter. The decision was set. It was about convenience, opportunity, not cause and effect.
That's chilling. But it wasn't just Iraq, was it? The plan Clark was shown went much further.
Much further. A few weeks after that initial conversation, Clark says he was shown a memo. And this memo, it apparently laid out the entire roadmap. The long-term objective was, and this is a direct quote Clark recounts, to take out 7 countries in 5 years.
7 countries in 5 years. Which ones? The list was specific, according to Clark's recollection. Start with Iraq, then move on to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and the final target, the big one, Iran.
Wow. So the war on terror wasn't this open-ended fight against a shadowy group called al-Qaeda. It was a specific military itinerary targeting nation states.
That's the interpretation presented in the source material. 9/11 provided the perfect trigger, the new Pearl Harbor, that certain neoconservative groups like the Project for the New American Century, PNIC, had actually written about wanting before 9/11 even happened. They needed a catalyst, and 9/11 became that catalyst.
And this plan, this list of 7 countries, the sources frame it as serving whose interests primarily?
They explicitly call it the execution of a Zionist script for war, meaning the targets weren't chosen based on a direct threat to the U.S. homeland, but because they were perceived as enemies or obstacles to Israeli strategic interests in the region. The U.S. military was being used, essentially, to fight Israel's regional rivals. And looking back, how many of those 7 countries have actually been taken out or destabilized since 2001?
Well, if you look at the list, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, destabilized, not fully taken out, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, that's 6 out of the 7 that have experienced major conflict, invasion, or internal collapse directly linked to policies stemming from that era.
In the 7th?
Iran. It remains the only country on that list not yet fully attacked or overthrown, which according to this analysis explains the constant drumbeat for conflict with Tehran that we still hear today. It's the unfinished business from that original memo.
This really reframes the motivation for 9/11 itself, doesn't it? If the response was pre-planned based on this list.
It does. The sources strongly argue that al-Qaeda's stated reasons for attacking the U.S., anger over U.S. troops on Saudi holy soil, U.S. support for Israel against the Palestinians, sanctions against Iraq were the actual reasons, not some abstract hatred of freedom. But acknowledging those reasons would have undermined the case for invading the 7 countries, none of which, apart from maybe Sudan briefly hosting bin Laden years earlier, had a direct hand in 9/11.
So by mischaracterizing the attacker's motives, the network could steer the public's anger towards the pre-selected targets on that list.
That's the argument. Manufacture consent for a war that was already decided.
Okay, so if the war itself was scripted, following this memo, then the actors involved, the groups doing the fighting on the ground, they couldn't have been truly independent, could they? Which brings us to this idea of terrorists as contractors.
Exactly. Rented militias, privateers. That's the next logical step in this analysis.
So this concept, privateers, it basically means groups like al-Qaeda, ISIS. They aren't really rogue actors driven purely by ideology.
According to the sources, no. Not fundamentally. They argue these groups are primarily political and military tools. They're described as rented militias. Or privateers, yes. Assets managed and paid for by state intelligence agencies.
Paid for?
Yes, put on the payroll, essentially. To achieve specific geopolitical goals, destabilizing a region, overthrowing a government, creating a pretext for intervention, but always, always with maximum deniability for the state sponsor pulling the strings.
It's like privatizing war, but using extremist groups instead of traditional mercenary companies like Blackwater or Academy, as they're now known.
It's a similar principle, yeah.
Yeah.
Why risk your own soldiers, your own political capital, when you can hire a proxy, dress them up in scary religious rhetoric, point them at your target, and deny everything if it goes wrong?
Has this model been used before? Does the source material give historical examples?
Oh, absolutely. They argue this isn't new. It's just been refined. The playbook itself is traced back to the old British Empire using actual privateers, pirates, basically to attack Spanish shipping without officially declaring war.
Okay, but more modern examples, U.S. examples.
The big one they point to is Operation Cyclone. That was the CIA program in the 1980s, funneling billions of dollars in weapons to the Afghan Mujahideen to fight the Soviets.
Right, the freedom fighters, as Reagan called them.
Exactly. But the sources argue this operation didn't just defeat the Soviets, it effectively created the modern Al-Qaeda. It built the infrastructure, the networks, the trained fighters, including bin Laden himself. We, or rather elements within the U.S. intelligence community, laid the groundwork.
And then the funding mechanism, the deniable money, that was perfected later. They point to the Iran-Contra affair in the mid-'80s as a key development. That really established the template. The U.S. covertly selling arms to Iran, a state sponsor of terror, and using the illegal profits, along with drug money, to fund the Contra rebels fighting the government in Nicaragua, another group the U.S. publicly condemned but privately supported. So illegal arms sales, drug trafficking, all laundered to fund deniable proxy wars.
That's the model. And the sources claim it was rolled out again at a massive scale in places like Syria more recently. Operations like Timber Sycamore, where the U.S. publicly denounced groups like ISIS and al-Nusra, but allegedly, through various cutouts and allies like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, was privately funding and arming many of the same or similar groups to overthrow Assad.
Public condemnation, private support.
The classic privateer model. Maximum chaos, minimum accountability.
What's really interesting, though, is the claim that this isn't just used overseas. The sources allege a similar model, a kind of terrorism management, happens domestically, too, with the FBI.
Yeah, that's a controversial part of the analysis. They call it the domestic counterterrorism industrial complex. The argument is that the FBI, in some cases, doesn't just wait for plots to happen, they actively encourage them.
Encourage them? How?
By using informants, sometimes agent provocateurs, to identify individuals often described as dim-witted pawns, and then basically walk them through planning an attack, providing fake bombs, driving them to the target, essentially facilitating the entire plot.
But why? To what end?
The sources claim the goal isn't necessarily to stop terrorism, but to manage it. Let the plot develop just far enough to become a big news story, then make a dramatic arrest. This justifies bigger budgets for the FBI, expands surveillance powers like the Patriot Act, and constantly reinforces the public perception that the government is keeping them safe from these ever-present shadowy threats they may have helped cultivate.
So it's about maintaining a low-level, manageable threat to justify the security state's existence and budget.
That's the cynical take presented in the sources. Perpetual management, not elimination.
Okay, bringing this back to the headline we started with. The case of Abu Muhammad al-Julani in Syria. His alleged transformation from wanted terrorist to potential diplomat. This privateer model makes that seem, well, plausible.
It makes it seem like the logical conclusion, doesn't it? Julani becomes the perfect real-time example. He was useful as a destabilizing force, an asset on the ledger with a $10 million bounty for deniability. But now, the geopolitical landscape is shifting. His current backers, Turkey, and especially the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC states like Saudi Arabia, UAE, they have different priorities now. Their main customer is China, and China wants stability for trade for its Belt and Road Initiative, not U.S.-sponsored chaos.
So the mission changes. The objective isn't destabilization anymore, it's managed stability.
Exactly. The old military-industrial complex, MIC, thrived on the chaos Julani helped create. But the new power player, what Dixon calls the financial-industrial complex, FIC, think huge asset managers like BlackRock, maybe figures like Trump representing big investment interests. They want stability. They want predictable regimes, places they can invest, pipelines they can build.
And Julani, the former al-Qaeda affiliate, is now useful in achieving that goal.
Precisely. He controls territory, he has fighters, he becomes a necessary placeholder for Turkey and the GCC. So suddenly, he's allegedly in Washington wearing a suit, negotiating the removal of sanctions. He's leveraging the control he gained as a terrorist to deliver regional stability for the FIC.
So the $10 million bounty wasn't a serious threat, it was just an accounting measure, part of his cover.
That's the implication. It kept him deniable while he was useful for chaos. Now that stability is the goal, the bounty disappears, the terrorist label gets quietly retired, and he's potentially rebranded as a legitimate political figure, a puppet leader for the new era. His transformation basically proves the point. These groups aren't independent actors. Their existence, their actions, even their labels are synthetic, dictated by the needs of their sponsors. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are no longer needed, they can be rented by others. That's how the source material puts it. Their utility changes, so their role changes, instantly.
The speed is what's staggering. Okay, if these groups are managed assets, it implies the intelligence agencies pulling the strings have immense power and operate with impunity, which leads us back to 9/11 itself. If it wasn't an intelligence failure, what was it? The sources point to active complicity, right? A multinational effort.
Yes. Forget failure. The sources argue the evidence points towards intentional active complicity involving elements within U.S. intelligence, Saudi intelligence, and Israeli intelligence. These aren't random players. They're the same groups historically involved in complex, deniable operations. Let's break that down. Section 4. the multinational intelligence nexus that allegedly orchestrated 9/11. Right, so we have to discard the idea that the agencies just missed the clues. The argument here is far darker. That key elements within these three intelligence communities, US, Saudi, Israeli, actively worked together or at least allowed it to happen, maybe even facilitated parts of it.
Okay, let's start with the US-Saudi connection. That seems crucial for the hijackers actually getting into the US and operating here.
It does. And this connection is partnership in covert ops. It has deep roots. The sources point back to the Safari Club formed in 1976. This is post-Watergate. Congress was trying to rein in the CIA.
Right, the church committee hearings and all that.
Exactly. So George H.W. Bush, who was CIA director at the time, allegedly helped set up the Safari Club involving France, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, initially Iran, specifically to run covert operations off the books, outside congressional oversight. And who funded it? Primarily Saudi money.
And the financial plumbing for these off-the-books operations.
That's where BCCI comes back in, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. It allegedly served as the main global laundromat for the whole enterprise, handling money for the CIA, the Safari Club ops, the Contras, even according to the sources, the early Al-Qaeda network.
Okay, so that's the historical context. How does this link specifically to the 9/11 hijackers? What happened after BCCI collapsed in the early 90s?
The money trail didn't stop. It just shifted banks. The sources follow it to Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C. They detail a specific flow of funds from Princess Haifa bint Faisal, she was the wife of the Saudi ambassador to the U.S., Prince Bandar bin Sultan.
Bandar Bush, they called him, right?
Yeah.
Because he was so close to the Bush family.
That's the one. So money allegedly flowed from Princess Haifa through Riggs Bank to the wife of a man named Osama Baznan. And Baznan wasn't just some random Saudi expat. He was reportedly a known Saudi intelligence operative.
And where did that money end up?
According to the 28 pages initially redacted from the 9/11 Commission report and other investigations, that money was used to directly support two of the key hijackers, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mithar, while they were living in San Diego before the attacks, paying for their apartment, living expenses, essentially providing logistical support on U.S. soil funded via Saudi channels with alleged intelligence ties.
So that's potential Saudi complicity. What about the U.S. side? Was it just incompetence that let these known operatives run around?
This is where the argument shifts from passive failure to active protection. The sources are adamant. The CIA, specifically its dedicated bin Laden unit, known as Alex Station, knew al-Hazmi and al-Mithar were dangerous al-Qaeda operatives. They even knew they were inside the United States.
They knew they were here, and they didn't tell the FBI.
Worse than that. According to multiple accounts, including from FBI agents involved, Alex Station deliberately withheld that crucial information from the FBI. There were multiple attempts by FBI agents who had picked up pieces of the puzzle to find these guys, to investigate them, and they were actively blocked by the CIA.
Blocked? You mean told to stand down?
Essentially, yes. Prevented from pursuing leads, denied access to information. Specific agents like Doug Miller, Mark Rossini, they've spoken about being stonewalled when trying to warn the FBI about Hazmi and Mithar being in the U.S.
That seems inexplicable if the goal was to stop attacks.
It does, and the sources argue this wasn't some low-level bureaucratic snafu. Blocking intelligence, that critical known al-Qaeda operatives on U.S. soil, that kind of decision, they argue, had to have come from the very top of the CIA. The implication points toward the DCI at the time, George Tenet.
And it wasn't just blocking investigations, was it? There's also the issue of how so many of the hijackers got visas in the first place.
Right. The logistical groundwork. A significant majority of the 19 hijackers apparently got their U.S. visas through a special expedited program run out of the U.S. consulate in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. This program was reportedly overseen or heavily influenced by the CIA.
And these weren't exactly model visa applicants.
Hardly. Many were described as basically store clerks and street vendors, young men with no plausible reason to travel to the U.S., no strong ties to their home country, often with incomplete applications. Yet they were waved through. The sources framed them as essentially low-level cannon fodder, recruited and given passage for a specific deadly purpose.
Okay, that covers the U.S. and Saudi angles of alleged complicity. What about the third element mentioned, Israeli intelligence? This often revolves around the story of the dancing Israelis.
It does. The sources allege significant active involvement by Israeli intelligence, specifically Mossad, operating in the U.S. under the cover of front companies. And the most explosive, most cited incident is the arrest of 5 Israeli men on the morning of 9/11.
These were the men in the white van.
That's them. They worked for a company called Urban Moving Systems, based in New Jersey. The FBI later reportedly concluded this company was, in fact, an intelligence front. These 5 men were arrested near the George Washington Bridge.
Why were they arrested? What were they doing?
Multiple eyewitnesses, including local residents and police officers, reported seeing them behaving very strangely. They were positioned in a parking lot overlooking the burning World Trade Center. And they weren't horrified or shocked. They were described as celebrating, high-fiving, taking photos of each other with the burning towers in the background, filming the event. Critically, some reports say this celebration was happening after the first tower was hit, but before the second plane struck.
Before the second plane, that implies.
Foreknowledge. That the event wasn't a complete surprise to them. Their behavior was described as if they were documenting a successful operation, not witnessing a tragedy.
And what was found when they were arrested in the van?
This is where it gets even more disturbing. Inside the van, police reportedly found maps of New York City with certain locations highlighted, including the World Trade Center complex and the specific spot they were parked at, the Doric Towers apartment building, suggesting their vantage point was pre-selected. They also found box cutters, like the ones allegedly used by the hijackers, multiple passports, and thousands of dollars in cash. And crucially, initial police reports and news coverage indicated the van tested positive for traces of explosives.
Explosives. In the van of men filming and celebrating the attack, that was the initial report, yes, though it was later downplayed or denied by some officials. But the evidence of foreknowledge didn't stop there. During interrogations, the sources claim one of the detainees, a man named Oded Elner, told investigators he first heard about the explosion at the World Trade Center via a telephone call at 8 a.m. that morning.
The first plane didn't hit until 8:46 a.m.
Exactly, 46 minutes before the first impact. If true, that's devastating evidence of prior knowledge. Another detail cited is that a different Israeli, identified only as Mamari, allegedly told a co-worker on 9/11, possibly referring to the towers, that they are taking down the second building, again suggesting specific advanced knowledge of the sequence of events.
This whole incident, the arrests, the evidence, the alleged foreknowledge, how was it handled officially?
It looks, according to the sources, like a classic cover-up designed to protect a sensitive intelligence relationship. The owner of Urban Moving Systems, the front company, apparently packed up and fled to Israel almost immediately after his employees were arrested.
He just disappeared.
Vanished back to Israel. Then there's the role of Bernard Kerik, who was the NYPD commissioner at the time. Kerik publicly denied reports that explosives were found in a different van stopped near the George Washington Bridge that day, contradicting several initial news accounts. And Kerik himself was later revealed to have, shall we say, complex financial ties, including accepting large, questionable loans from Israeli businessmen and figures linked to organized crime before 9/11. He was eventually convicted on corruption charges.
So the person overseeing the city's security response was potentially compromised and actively downplaying key evidence.
That's the picture the sources paint. As for the 5 Israelis themselves, they were held for 71 days. They reportedly failed multiple polygraph tests, specifically when asked about their surveillance activities. But despite all this, they were eventually released and deported back to Israel, allegedly following intense political pressure from the Israeli government.
Deported, not prosecuted.
Deported. And later, some of them filed this highly publicized lawsuit against the U.S. government for wrongful detention. The sources dismissed this lawsuit as a pure PR stunt, a way to publicly proclaim their innocence and debunk the lie, as they put it, without ever actually having to face the risks of evidence discovery in a real contested court case. It was never seriously pursued.
So taking all these threads together, the Saudi funding trail, the CIA blocking the FBI, the Israeli team seemingly documenting the event with foreknowledge, the sources argue this points not to failure, but to a complex, protected multinational intelligence operation that allowed 9/11 to happen.
Or actively facilitated parts of it. That's the core allegation.
Okay, so the event happens, the shock event, but shock fades. How did the network, according to this analysis, ensure that the public and politicians stayed compliant enough to approve the wars and the surveillance state that followed? They needed to sustain the fear.
Yeah, they did. The initial shock of 9/11 was powerful but transient. To lock in the agenda specifically, to ram through things like the Patriot Act and build unwavering support for invading Iraq, they needed a second wave, a follow-on attack to keep the terror alive. And that, the sources argue, was the purpose of the 2001 anthrax attacks.
So the anthrax attacks were part of the plan, a domestic false flag. Let's get into that manufacturing consent.
Yeah, the analysis positions the anthrax attacks, coming just weeks after 9/11, as a deliberate domestic psychological operation. A false flag designed specifically to terrify the public and critically coerce Congress just as the initial shock was wearing off.
What's the evidence for it being a domestic op, not foreign terrorists?
Well, first, there's the bizarre framing. The letters containing the anthrax spores had these crude, almost cartoonish messages like death to America, death to Israel, clearly trying to point the finger at foreign jihadists. And the media, along with figures in the administration, immediately blamed Iraq or Al-Qaeda.
But the science pointed elsewhere, completely elsewhere. Forensic analysis quickly determined the specific strain of anthrax used, the highly weaponized AIM strain, could only have come from one place. A U.S. military research lab, specifically the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRIDE, at Fort Detrick, Maryland. The FBI knew almost immediately it was a domestic source with access to top-level bioweapons material. Yet the public narrative blaming foreign enemies continued for months. And who were the targets of these letters? Was it random? Not at all. The targeting seems incredibly precise, almost surgically targeted to achieve a political goal. Ensuring the passage of the Patriot Act, which faced significant opposition initially. Who were the main opponents? The two most powerful Democrats in the Senate at the time, Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle and Senator Patrick Leahy, who was chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Both were raising serious concerns about the civil liberties implications of the proposed Patriot Act. And they both received letters containing the most potent lethal anthrax spores. Wow, so the message was, get in line, or else.
That's how the sources interpret it. A direct threat to the leaders of the opposition. Contrast that with who didn't get lethal anthrax. Judith Miller, the New York Times reporter who was aggressively pushing the false narrative about Iraqi WMDs and became a key mouthpiece for the pro-war faction. She received a letter, but it contained only hoax powder, not real anthrax.
So she gets the publicity, the fear factor, without the actual danger, while the key opponents get the potentially lethal stuff.
Exactly. Miller used her hoax letter experience to further amplify public fear and make the case for war and enhance security measures. The targeting seems deliberately designed to neutralize political opposition and maximize useful propaganda. And this happened just as the administration needed justification for the next step on that 7-country list, Iraq. Precisely.
Yeah.
And the anthrax attacks provided the perfect opportunity to launch the next big lie connecting Iraq to terror. Almost immediately after the anthrax letter surfaced, Israeli intelligence reportedly fed a story to the U.S. intelligence community.
What was the story?
They claimed to have evidence, supposedly from a meeting in Prague, Czech Republic, showing Iraqi intelligence officials giving anthrax to Mohammed Atta, the alleged 9/11 ringleader.
Atta in Prague meeting Iraqi spies getting anthrax. Was any of that true?
According to exhaustive investigation later, including by Czech intelligence and the FBI, it was entirely false. Atta wasn't even in Prague at the time this meeting supposedly occurred, and there was zero evidence Iraq possessed weaponized anthrax or had any operational link to Atta for 9/11. It was a complete fabrication.
But it served its purpose.
Perfectly. This fictional Prague meeting became the evidence relentlessly pushed by neoconservatives in the administration, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Perle, James Woolsey, and amplified through sympathetic media outlets. It was the key piece of disinformation used to link Iraq to 9/11 and the anthrax threat, thereby justifying the pre-planned invasion.
So you have the manufactured crisis with the anthrax, the manufactured intelligence linking it to Iraq. But then there was the official investigation into 9/11 itself, the 9/11 Commission. Surely that was meant to find the truth.
The sources argue the exact opposite, that the 9/11 Commission was designed from the very start not to find the truth, but to contain it, to produce a politically acceptable narrative that protected the key institutions, the White House, the CIA, the FBI, and crucial foreign allies like Saudi Arabia and Israel from any real scrutiny or accountability.
How could it be designed that way? Weren't there prominent people on it?
There were, but look at the leadership in the process. The executive director, the man responsible for shaping the entire investigation and final report, was Philip Zelikow.
Okay. Who was he?
Zelikow wasn't some neutral historian. He was a Bush administration insider. In fact, he was the primary author of the administration's 2002 National Security Strategy document, the very document that formally adopted the policy of preemptive war, the policy that 9/11 was used as the justification for.
Wait, the guy who wrote the policy justifying the war was put in charge of investigating the event that triggered the war?
It's an astounding conflict of interest, isn't it? And it gets worse. Zelikow had also previously co-authored a book where he specifically argued that the primary reason for the U.S. to be concerned about Iraq and WMDs was the threat they posed to Israel. He literally stated that the Iraq war was being fought, in part, to protect Israeli interests. And this is the man leading the supposedly impartial investigation.
It's hard to believe.
The sources argue it was deliberate, choosing someone guaranteed to steer the investigation away from inconvenient truths and towards the preordained conclusion. And the commission itself included members who were signatories to the Project for the New American Century, PNA.
The group that wanted a new Pearl Harbor.
The very same. The commission was stacked with people who had a vested interest in validating the administration's narrative and the wars that followed.
What about whistleblowers? Or staff investigators who found things that didn't fit the official story?
They were sidelined, gagged, or ignored. The sources point to FBI translator Sybil Edmonds, who tried to provide testimony about foreign intelligence infiltration and complicity related to 9/11. She was gagged under the rarely used state secrets privilege.
Silenced.
Completely. And within the commission staff itself, an investigator named Dana Leisman reportedly uncovered significant evidence detailing the Saudi government links to the hijackers, the kind of stuff found in those 28 redacted pages. What happened? She was reportedly fired from the commission staff, and her research findings were deleted, scrubbed from the internal record before the final report was written.
So evidence that pointed towards official Saudi involvement was actively suppressed by the commission itself.
That's the allegation. Meanwhile, you had this parallel operation running inside the Pentagon called the Office of Special Plans, OSP. This was a separate intelligence unit set up by neocons like Douglas Faith and reporting directly to Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz. Its entire purpose was to bypass the regular intelligence agencies, like the CIA, which was skeptical about Iraq's WMDs and al-Qaeda links, and cherry-pick or outright fabricate intelligence to make the case for war.
So the OSP was feeding the lies, like the Prague meeting.
Exactly. They were the source of much of the disinformation about Iraqi WMDs and ties to al-Qaeda, including the fake Atta in Prague story. It was a dedicated lie factory, working in tandem with the controlled investigation of the 9/11 Commission to ensure the desired outcome. War with Iraq, based on a false pretext generated by 9/11. It paints a picture of a system-wide effort to manipulate intelligence and control the narrative from the moment 9/11 happened through the invasion of Iraq.
A comprehensive deception is how the sources frame it. Okay, so that's the historical analysis of how the network allegedly operated post 9/11. But the world has changed dramatically since then. How does this proof of weapons network, this model of manufactured crisis for profit and control, adapt to today's geopolitical realities, especially with the rise of China and shifts in the Middle East?
That's the crucial question for understanding the present and future, according to this analysis. The network, being fundamentally about profit and power, has to adapt. The old model is becoming less profitable, less effective, so the tactics shift. Let's get into that. Section 6, current geopolitics and the shifting power dynamics.
Right, so the world we live in now is very different from 2001 or 2003. The foundational assumptions that underpin the network's post-9/11 strategy are eroding.
What's the biggest change driver?
Two main things, interconnected. First, U.S. energy independence. Thanks to fracking and domestic production, the U.S. is no longer primarily dependent on Middle Eastern oil. In fact, it's now a major competitor to countries like Saudi Arabia in the global energy market. Okay, how does that change the dynamic? It fundamentally alters the U.S.-Saudi relationship. For decades, the deal was the U.S. provides military protection to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia guarantees stable oil flow and critically recycles its oil profits, petrodollars, back into the U.S. economy, buying U.S. debt and assets, propping up the dollar, the petrodollar system.
Exactly. But now the U.S. doesn't need Saudi oil as much, and it's competing with them. This drastically reduces Saudi Arabia's reliance on the U.S. security guarantee, and therefore their incentive to keep buying billions in U.S. weapons or holding trillions in U.S. debt.
And who is Saudi Arabia selling its oil to now, primarily?
China. China is now Saudi Arabia's biggest customer by far. And China has very different priorities than the U.S., especially the U.S. focused on the old MIC model. China wants regional stability. It needs reliable energy supplies and secure trade routes for its Belt and Road initiative. It doesn't want endless U.S.-sponsored wars and chaos disrupting things.
So China is actively pushing for peace in the region.
Actively. The sources point to China brokering the normalization of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia as a prime example. These two were arch enemies for decades, a conflict the proof of weapons network allegedly stoked constantly. China stepped in and basically said, this fighting is bad for business, make peace. And they did. That's a massive shift, unthinkable just a few years ago.
And what does this mean for the financial side of the network, the recycling of petrodollars?
It means the GCC states, flush with cash from selling oil and gas to Asia, are now diversifying their investments. They're using their massive sovereign wealth funds not just to buy U.S. treasuries, but to invest globally, often in partnership with China, buying up infrastructure companies' assets all over the world through foreign direct investment, FDI.
So the money isn't automatically flowing back to prop up the dollar and the U.S. MIC anymore.
Less and less. It's actively weakening the dollar's dominance and shifting global financial power away from the U.S. towards the East. The old MIC model, which relied on that constant flow of recycled petrodollars fueling conflict, is seeing its core profit mechanism erode.
Which brings us back again to Jelani in Syria. His situation perfectly illustrates this shift from the MIC model to the FIC model, right?
It's the clearest example. Under the old MIC paradigm, Syria was deliberately plunged into chaos. You had ISIS creating havoc, fueling a brutal civil war, various proxy forces fighting. The sources even mention Kurdish groups being used to protect Syrian oil fields, with the oil allegedly sold off illicitly to fund black operations. Maximum chaos, maximum profit for the war machine.
And now, under the new financial industrial complex, FIC priorities.
The FIC wants stability. They want Syria pacified so they can rebuild it, invest in it, run pipelines through it, integrate it into regional trade networks. They need a predictable, controllable government, even if it's headed by someone who used to be labeled a terrorist.
So Jelani, backed by Turkey and the GCC, who are now aligning more with China's stability agenda, becomes the convenient placeholder. He can deliver the necessary control on the ground.
Exactly. He transitions from a tool of chaos for the MIC to a potential tool of stability for the FIC. He's negotiating sanctions removal, not because he suddenly believes in democracy, but because the GCC needs sanctions lifted to facilitate their investments in regional integration plans, which in turn benefits the global FIC. His label changes based entirely on who finds him useful and for what purpose.
The privateer gets a new contract, essentially.
You could put it that way, yeah.
So if the old model of profiting from endless overseas wars is declining due to these global shifts, what's the warning here? What does the network do next, according to Dixon's analysis? Does it just fade away?
Not a chance, according to the sources. The warning is actually quite alarming. As the traditional profit centers overseas dry up, and as the dollar potentially weakens, the network won't just shut down shop. Instead, it turns its focus inward.
Inward, meaning?
The tactics perfected abroad, the funding of extremist groups, the stoking of sectarian conflict, the use of propaganda and disinformation, the manufacturing of crises, the colored revolutions are now being brought home to the West.
You mean used against domestic populations in the U.S. and Europe?
That's the explicit warning. The sources argue that the extreme political polarization, the culture wars, the social fragmentation, the riots, the seemingly intractable divisions we see in Western societies today, these aren't necessarily organic phenomena. They are, at least in part, being deliberately manufactured or amplified by the same network.
Why? To what end?
To create new internal crises, new enemies within, new justifications for surveillance, social control, and censorship, new profit streams for the Homeland Security apparatus, the tech companies involved in monitoring populations, the private security firms. If you can't profit from bombing foreigners, you profit from policing your own citizens. You manufacture domestic conflict to replace foreign wars.
That's a profoundly pessimistic view of current events.
It is, but it's the logical endpoint of the analysis presented. The network needs enemies and needs crises to justify its existence and profits. If the external enemies become less useful or less accessible, it will cultivate internal ones.
So wrapping this all up, what's the key takeaway for you, the listener, from this deep dive into Simon Dixon's analysis of Ryan Dawson's work?
I think the main takeaway is about pattern recognition. It's understanding that the crises presented to you, whether foreign or domestic, might not be what they seem on the surface. They might be manufactured or at least heavily manipulated to serve an underlying financial or geopolitical agenda that has little to do with the official explanation.
It's about seeing the blueprint behind the headlines.
Exactly. The sources argue that the enormous U.S. national debt, $35 trillion, and counting the endless wars, the pervasive censorship, the surveillance state, none of this would have been possible without the pretext provided by 9/11. Understanding how that pretext was allegedly manufactured and how the proof of weapons network operates through plausible deniability and proxy forces is crucial.
Crucial to avoid being what the sources might call a useful idiot.
Precisely. to avoid passively accepting the narratives fed to you and instead become an active, informed participant who questions the mechanics of power.
Well, thank you for joining us on this really intense and challenging deep dive. We hope exploring these concepts, plausible deniability, the privateer model, the weaponization of ideology, the alleged manipulation of intelligence as laid out by Simon Dixon gives you a different lens through which to view world events. And perhaps we can leave you with one final provocative question to think about, building on this analysis. If this proof of weapons network uses manufactured conflict to achieve its goals, and if it allegedly followed that 7-country list derived from General Clark's account, what might be the ultimate final conflict needed to complete that original vision, the one that reshapes the global order entirely? And you look at the list, and you look at the one country remaining, the one that has faced relentless pressure, sanctions, and threats of war for decades now, Iran. Is that the final move on the chessboard for this network? Something to consider?